What would you do if you found something worth millions and nobody else knew? A broke single father, a burned-out wreck, a billionaire who thought she was selling garbage. Logan Hayes paid $500 for a pile of scorched metal sitting in a dead woman's garage. What he found underneath the ash wasn't just a car. It was a secret someone had killed careers to protect. And when the wrong people realized what he'd uncovered, they came for him. This is the story of the Ferrari that was never supposed to be found. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. The thing nobody tells you about being broke is that it's not one big dramatic moment. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It creeps in quietly. A Tuesday when the water bill comes due the same week the alternator dies. A Wednesday when you're standing in the cereal aisle doing math in your head, deciding between the name brand and the store brand, and your 7-year-old is pulling on your sleeve asking if they can get the one with the cartoon toucan on the box. And you have to say, "Not today, bud," in a voice that sounds casual, like it's no big deal, like you're not counting the exact dollars in your account. That was Logan Hayes at 32. He wasn't a failure. He was clear-eyed about that most days. He had a trade. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that other mechanics noticed and said nothing about because competence in a quiet man reads as threatening. Logan could look at a rusted-out body panel and tell you not just what had happened to it, but roughly when, and in what conditions, and what it would take to bring it back. He had hands that understood metal the way some people understand language, intuitively, without having to think about it. His shop, Hayes Restoration, occupied a converted double garage on the east side of Palmetto Bay, Florida. The sign outside was hand-painted because he'd never gotten around to ordering a real one, and the parking lot was cracked asphalt with a strip of dead grass down the middle where the concrete had heaved. Inside, the space was organized in the particular way of a man who worked alone. Everything had a place, but the places only made sense to him. Rags folded a certain way. Wrenches arranged by feel rather than size. An old radio in the corner tuned permanently to a classic rock station that faded to static when the humidity spiked. He'd started the business 4 years ago, after his marriage ended. That was how he thought of it. After the marriage ended. Clean, passive, no blame assigned. The truth was a bit more jagged. Sarah had left, and she'd had her reasons. And some of those reasons were fair and some weren't. And Logan had spent the first year turning that over in his head every night before he fell asleep, and had eventually decided it was more useful to just get up in the morning and work. The divorce had left him with the shop, the tools, a mortgage on a small house in a neighborhood where the palm trees were scraggly and half the mailboxes were broken, and full custody of his son, Caleb. Caleb was the non-negotiable. Everything else was logistics. The kid was 7 going on 45. Serious in the way of children who've spent a lot of time around adults who are trying hard, who've absorbed the ambient tension of careful budgeting and polite explanations about why they couldn't do certain things right now. He had Logan's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and a habit of asking questions that required real answers. Not, "Why is the sky blue?" but, "Dad, if you work so hard, why don't we have more money?" Asked with no cruelty, just genuine curiosity, the way a scientist asks about something that doesn't add up. Logan had told him the truth, approximately. "Because the kind of work I do takes time, and time is the one thing money can't manufacture. But we're okay, Cal. We're fine." Fine was mostly accurate. They ate. The house had air conditioning, which in Florida is not a luxury. Caleb went to a decent public school and had a best friend named Marcus and a shelf of library books he rotated through obsessively. Logan had health insurance through a program he'd qualified for, which he was privately grateful for every single month. They had a dog named Rust, a 3-legged terrier mix they'd rescued from the county shelter, who slept at the foot of Caleb's bed and cost money in food and vet bills that Logan had not entirely accounted for when they'd brought him home, but who had been worth every penny in the particular economy of a child's happiness. What they didn't have was margin. There was no cushion. The shop was doing okay, had a few regulars, a couple of local car collectors who sent him work, but okay meant covering expenses and paying himself a salary that didn't embarrass him, not saving, not growing. He'd been trying for 2 years to land a contract with a classic car dealer out of Miami who could have sent him steady work, but those conversations kept stalling. Too small. Not enough throughput. Come back when you've got more capacity. which required money he didn't have. He checked his phone constantly in those days. Marketplace listings, auction notices, estate sales, always looking for the underpriced thing, the overlooked piece, the car that someone's grandkid was selling for nothing because they didn't know what they had. It was how he'd built his inventory, carefully, slowly, one find at a time. A '67 Mustang he'd bought for parts and managed to make run again. A Triumph TR6 he'd gotten from a widower outside Homestead who just wanted it gone. Small things. Nothing that changed the math in any meaningful way. He'd been doing this long enough to know that the big find was mostly myth. A story guys told at car shows, the equivalent of a fishing tale. But knowing something is mostly myth doesn't mean it can't happen. The odds are long. They're not zero. The listing appeared on a Thursday evening in late October. Logan was at the kitchen table after dinner, laptop open, Caleb doing homework across from him with Rust wedged between his feet under the chair. The TV was on in the other room, some cartoon Caleb had been watching earlier, and the house smelled like the pasta they'd had and the faint diesel that never entirely left Logan's hands, no matter how long he scrubbed. He almost scrolled past it. The listing was sparse, the way estate sale listings often are when the person posting it doesn't really understand what they have. No photos at first, just a brief description. Fire-damaged vehicle, stored in garage, condition unknown, sold as is. $500 or reasonable offer. Cash only. No deliveries. Viewing by appointment, contact Victoria A. The make and model weren't listed. That alone was interesting. Either the seller didn't know, which happened with estate sales, or they deliberately omitted it, which happened when the seller thought the information might drive the price up. Based on the $500 ask, it was probably the former. The location was what made Logan pause. The address was in Coral Gables. The quiet part, the old money part, where the streets were wide and shaded and the houses sat behind walls covered in bougainvillea. Estate sale territory, the kind of home where things got tucked in garages and forgotten for decades. He clicked for more information. 2 photos had been added belatedly, clearly taken with someone's phone in bad lighting. The first showed a tarp covering something car-shaped in a garage that was itself a museum piece. Stone floor, wooden shelving along the walls, old oil cans lined up with someone's obsessive neatness. The second photo was worse, blurry and underexposed, showing what appeared to be a heavily fire-damaged front end. The hood buckled and charred, the windshield frame warped, the paint burned down to bare metal, and worse, in long-running streaks like the fire had moved fast and hot. Most people would see those photos and close the tab. Logan stared at them for 4 minutes. There was something about the shape of the front end, the nose. Even through the damage, through the blur of a bad photo and the distortion of heat damage, there was something about the way the body panels met. He couldn't have explained it precisely. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in the fingertips rather than the brain, a recognition, not a thought. He opened a second tab and pulled up a reference library of Italian sports cars from the 60s through the 90s. Started comparing. The roofline in the background of the second photo, just barely visible behind the charred frame, the curvature of what had been the front quarter panel. He sat with it for a while. "Dad," Caleb said, not looking up from his worksheet, "you're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The staring thing, when you find something." "I might have found something." Caleb looked up then, and for a moment he looked exactly like Logan. Same slight frown of concentration, same tilt of the head. "Is it good?" "I don't know yet, probably nothing." "But maybe not nothing." "Go finish your homework, Cal." The kid went back to his worksheet, but Logan could see the small smile at the corner of his mouth. Logan picked up his phone and dialed the number in the listing. She answered on the third ring, and her voice surprised him. Not what he'd expected. He'd built a vague mental image from the listing details. Older woman, probably, handling a family estate, slightly impatient with the logistics of selling off things she didn't understand. Victoria Ashford sounded like she was about his age. Her voice was clear and direct, with the particular neutrality of someone who'd been educated in the kind of places where you learn to modulate yourself, but underneath it, something unguarded. A slight tension, the sound of a person managing more than she was letting on. "Yes, it's still available," she said. I've had a few calls, but nobody serious. It's in bad shape. I should be honest with you about that. How bad? Fire damage. Significant. It was in a separate structure on the property, the detached garage, and it caught during an electrical fire about 3 years ago. The garage sustained serious damage. The car was inside. What kind of car is it? A pause. That's a question I genuinely can't answer fully. It was my grandfather's. He passed 8 months ago, and we're settling the estate. His records are... She paused again, and he could hear her choosing words carefully. Not perfectly organized. I know he purchased it in the early 90s. I believe it's Italian. That's the extent of what I can tell you. Can I see it? When? Tomorrow morning, if that works. Another pause, shorter this time. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock works. He was up at 5 the next morning, not because he needed to be, but because sleep had stopped being available somewhere around 2 a.m. He made coffee, sat in the dark kitchen, and tried to be rational with himself. Probably nothing. Fire-damaged vehicle from the estate of a wealthy old man, make unknown, condition terrible. Could be anything. A Fiat, a rusted-out Alfa, something that had been worth $20,000 once and was worth considerably less than $500 now. He made a list of what he'd bring. His inspection kit. A flashlight. 2, actually. His reference books, because he'd feel stupid having them in the car, and more stupid not. His phone charged to full. He dropped Caleb at his neighbor, Mrs. Fernandez's house at 7:30, pressed a $10 bill into her hand for breakfast, and drove north on US 1 toward Coral Gables. The Ashford estate was set back from the road behind an iron gate that was open when he arrived. The house was the kind of thing that happened when someone with real money built something in the 1920s, and then it survived, mostly intact, through a century of Florida weather and changing tastes. Mediterranean revival Logan's mind supplied. He'd grown up looking at architecture the way other kids looked at cars, noticing things. Red tile roof, stucco facade the color of old cream, a live oak out front that had been there longer than anyone currently alive. Victoria Ashford met him at the gate. She was not what he'd pictured. She was tall, almost his height, with dark hair pulled back in a way that looked efficient rather than styled, and she was wearing clothes that were clearly expensive but had that particular worn quality of someone who puts on what's comfortable and doesn't think about it much after. No jewelry except a watch. She shook his hand with a firm grip and looked at him directly, the way people do when they're assessing someone and not trying to hide that they're doing it. Logan Hayes, she said. Like the sign on your truck. Guilty. You drive an hour for a $500 car with fire damage. It wasn't quite a question. I drive an hour to look at one. Haven't bought anything yet. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Fair. The garage is around the back. They walked along a stone path that wound around the side of the main house. The grounds were slightly overgrown in the way of a property where the person who cared about it is gone and the people managing the estate are focused elsewhere. Not neglected, exactly, just missing something, intention maybe. The detached garage was a separate structure, older than the house's additions, set at the far end of a courtyard. It was a 4-car space, or had been. The fire damage was visible from outside. A section of the roof had been partially rebuilt, newer tiles mismatched against the old ones, and one of the wooden beams at the entrance was scorched black in a way that new paint hadn't entirely concealed. The electrical fire started in the back left corner, Victoria said, unlocking a padlock on the main door. 2 of my grandfather's other vehicles were in here at the time, a vintage Jaguar and a Porsche. Both were total losses. There was nothing left worth salvaging. The fire suppression system in the garage activated, but it was old and the response was slow. The fire department contained it, but didn't exactly save everything. She pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, that particular combination of old smoke and enclosed space, 3 years of it soaked into the walls. The garage was dim, the overhead lights flickering before they steadied. Most of the shelving Logan had seen in the listing photo was still there, the oil cans in their neat rows. Someone had been meticulous about this space. In the center, under a gray canvas tarp, was the car. Go ahead, Victoria said. She'd stopped near the door, giving him space, and he appreciated that. Some sellers hovered. She watched from a distance, arms crossed, expression neutral. Logan walked around it first, just to see the dimensions, the footprint. The car under the tarp was low and not especially long, compact actually, by sports car standards. He crouched at the rear, noting the way the tarp fell over the tail end, the specific shape of it. Then he pulled the tarp off. He didn't react. He'd trained himself not to, years of looking at cars in front of sellers who were always watching for the moment of recognition. You could overpay for a car in the span of a widened eye. But something happened in his chest, a kind of clenching, like a held breath. The fire damage was severe. The front end was the worst. The hood had buckled under the heat, and the paint on that end was entirely gone, down to bare metal, and in some places down to what looked like the primer beneath the metal. The windshield was gone, the frame warped but identifiable. The driver's side was worse than the passenger side, consistent with the fire having burned hotter on that end. The interior was largely destroyed. Whatever upholstery had been there was gone. The dashboard instrumentation melted into abstract shapes, wiring hanging loose and heat fused in places. The rear end was in comparatively better condition. The fire had moved front to back, and the rear had caught less of it, though the paint there was also blistered and gone in large patches. Logan started at the front and worked his way around. Slowly. He wasn't thinking in words yet, just absorbing shapes, proportions, physical reality. The body style was unmistakable once you were this close. Berlinetta, fixed roof coupe, Italian in its proportions, the way the greenhouse sat in relation to the body, the slope of the rear deck. The wheelbase was right. The track width was right. He measured it with his hands, then with the tape measure he'd brought, crouching in the dim garage light. He looked at the Pininfarina lines, even under the damage, the curvature of the rear haunches. He looked at the number stamps on the body panels, the ones that survived, and compared them against what he'd memorized from his references. Then he found the chassis plate. It was on the inner sill, partially protected because that section of the body had been between the fire and the concrete floor. The plate itself was warped and discolored, but the numbers were legible. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. He photographed each digit carefully, his phone screen bright in the dim space. He made himself stand up and walk away from the car, walked to the back of the garage and stood among the old oil cans and breathed for a moment. Victoria spoke from the doorway. "Well?" He turned around. "Has anyone else looked at this? Seriously looked at it?" "Seriously? No. An insurance adjuster looked at it 3 years ago when we filed the claim for the fire damage. He was here for maybe 20 minutes, looked at everything, wrote up his report. He assessed the car as a total loss with essentially no residual value. That's how we've treated it since." "What was the assessed value? Before the fire?" Victoria shook her head slightly. "I'd have to look that up. Grandfather had it insured, but he insured everything. He treated insurance the way other people treat oxygen. Something you didn't go without." She paused. "Why? What are you seeing?" Logan looked at the car for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I think you should know," he said carefully, "that I might be completely wrong." "About what?" "About what this is." He paused. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Edward Ashford." She said it with a weight that was still fresh. 8 months, he reminded himself. Not long. Why? Did he talk about this car, ever? Anything specific about where he got it, when, from whom? Victoria's expression shifted, something careful moving across it. He didn't talk about it much toward the end. He talked more about the Ferrari he'd had in the 70s. She stopped. He always called it the Ferrari, even after... She gestured at the burned wreck. Even after the fire. I assumed he meant he missed it, that he was remembering how it used to be. He called this one the Ferrari? Logan kept his voice level. Specifically. Yes. She looked at him. You better tell me what you think you're seeing. Logan exhaled slowly. I need to run down some numbers before I say anything definitive. What I'll tell you is that if I'm right, and I might not be, this car is worth considerably more than $500. Victoria was quiet for a moment, then very dry. How considerably? I don't want to guess yet. I don't want to be wrong in a way that gets either of our hopes up. He paused. I'd like to buy the car at the listed price, $500. And I'd like to be honest with you. If my research confirms what I think, I'll tell you. Either way. She looked at him for a long time. It was the look of someone running calculations, not about money exactly, but about whether a person was worth trusting. You don't have to tell me, she said finally. If you buy it for $500 and it turns out to be worth more, that's the risk I took listing it the way I did. I know. But you're saying you would anyway. I'm saying I will. Another long pause. All right, she said. $500, cash. He paid her in the parking area, counting out the bills from an envelope he'd brought because he'd been optimistic enough to bring it. She wrote him a receipt on a notepad she pulled from her jacket pocket. Property address, sale price, one vehicle, fire damaged, sold as is. Her handwriting was neat and slightly angular. He loaded the car onto his trailer with a portable winch, working slowly because the body was fragile in places and he didn't want to stress the frame. Victoria watched from a distance, and when he was done and was securing the tie-downs, she walked over. You drove an hour on a listing with no make, no model, one blurry photograph, she said. What did you see in that photo? Logan looked at her. The shape of the front end. The nose. That told you something. It suggested something. It was enough to make the drive worth it. She looked at the covered shape on his trailer. My grandfather spent 50 years accumulating things. Cars, art, first editions. He had what he called a sense for value. Said it came from paying attention. Said most people look but don't see. Logan secured the last strap. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was. She said it simply. Drive safe, Mr. Hayes. He drove back south through the morning traffic, the trailer behind him, and didn't turn on the radio. He put Caleb to bed that night, and then went to the shop and stayed there until 1 in the morning. He'd photographed everything on the car that could be photographed. The chassis plate, the remaining body stampings, the engine. He'd gotten a look at it, though the fire had been brutal there too, and certain things were obscured by damage and grime. He'd photographed the serial number sequences from multiple angles, with 2 different light sources, and had spent an hour enhancing the images on his laptop until the digits were as clear as he could make them. Then he started making calls. He had 3 contacts in the world of classic Italian car authentication, people he'd met at various points in his career through the circuitous social network of car restoration. None of them were celebrities in the field. They were the working-level people, the technician who'd spent 15 years doing hands-on authentication work for a major auction house before going independent, the archivist who'd cataloged production records for a decade, and an older man named Ferdinand who had grown up in Maranello in the 1970s, whose father had worked at the factory, and who now operated a small consultancy out of his house in Boca Raton, doing the kind of authentication work that never made it into press releases. Ferdinand picked up on the first ring, which was unusual, and Logan took it as a sign. I have numbers, Logan said without preamble. Partial chassis ID, some body stampings, some surviving production code fragments. I need you to run them. What am I running them against? Logan read him the digits. There was silence on the other end of the line. Say those again, Ferdinand said. His voice had shifted into something that was professionally careful, the way a doctor's voice shifts when they're looking at something in a scan. Logan read them again. Where did you get this car? Estate sale, Coral Gables. Fire damage? Significant. How significant? Severe on the front 2/3, rear is better. Engine is accessible but affected. Chassis plate I found on the inner sill, partially protected. Another silence. Longer this time. I need to come see it, Ferdinand said. I know, before you do. Just from the numbers, without seeing it. What is this? Ferdinand was quiet for what felt like a long time. Logan could hear him breathing, hear the distant sound of a television somewhere in Ferdinand's house, the muffled sound of his wife asking something in the background. If the numbers are correct, Ferdinand said finally, and his voice was doing something unusual, the careful neutrality of a man suppressing something. And I am not confirming anything without a physical examination. Ferdinand, you understand that there were very few of them. How few? Officially documented surviving examples. In the world, you can count them without using both hands. Logan sat very still in his shop chair. And the fire, he said. The fire damage. would not necessarily affect authenticity or fundamental value, Ferdinand said. Not if the structural identity is intact. Not if the documentation chain can be established. He paused. There are buyers for these cars in any condition. There are buyers who would rather have a verified example at 30% of cosmetic integrity than not have one at all. Logan looked across the shop at the covered car. Come tomorrow, he said. First thing. After he hung up, he sat in the dark shop for a while. Rust had followed him from the house. The dog had a habit of trailing him, three-legged and faithful, and was now curled up on an old moving blanket near the door. The shop smelled like metal and oil, and the faint char that the car was putting into the air. Logan pressed his palms flat on the workbench in front of him and looked at the shape under the tarp. $500. He thought about the $500 in the context of the month he'd had. He thought about Caleb's school field trip he'd almost had to say no to. He thought about the rear tires on the truck that needed replacing. He thought about Victoria Ashford's face when she'd said he was someone worth knowing. Okay, he said quietly. Not to anyone. To the car, maybe, or to himself. Let's figure out what you are. Ferdinand Ortega arrived at 7:15 the next morning in a 1994 Volvo with 200,000 miles on it and a cracked bumper held together with a zip tie. He was 63 years old, built like a man who'd spent his youth doing physical work and his middle age behind a desk, with gray stubble and hands that were slightly arthritic but still moved with precision when he needed them to. He walked around the car 3 times before touching it. Logan stood back and let him work. This was not a moment for talking. Ferdinand's examination was methodical in the way of someone who'd done it hundreds of times, but treated each instance as though it were the first. Careful, unhurried, genuinely attentive. He used a jeweler's loupe for the smaller stampings. He photographed things from angles Logan hadn't thought of. He spent an unusual amount of time at the rear of the car, where the surviving body panels were least damaged, running his thumb along surfaces and then looking at whatever was on his thumb. 90 minutes passed. Logan drank 2 cups of coffee and watched from across the shop. At the end of it, Ferdinand straightened up with the slight wince of a man whose knees had opinions about garage floors and looked at Logan. It needs full authentication, he said. Documents, provenance chain, factory records cross-reference. That's a weeks-long process, and it's not cheap. I understand that. And there are elements that will be difficult because of the fire. Some records that might have been in the car are gone. The provenance gap in the 90s will need to be bridged through other means. Ferdinand. The older man looked at him. His face was doing nothing deliberate. That was what made it remarkable. In my opinion, Ferdinand said quietly, based on what I can see today, you have a genuine example. The word genuine landed in the space between them like something physical. Okay, Logan said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. A 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO. Ferdinand said the name carefully, the way you say the name of something that has weight. One of the rarest production automobiles in existence. 36 were built. The whereabouts of a number of those examples are uncertain. There are debates in the authentication community, ongoing, about specific cars. He paused. This could be one of the disputed examples, or it could be something else entirely. But the physical evidence I see today, he shook his head slightly. I've been doing this for a long time. I know what I'm looking at. Logan sat down on a shop stool. He hadn't planned to. Ferdinand watched him with something that wasn't unsympathetic. You paid $500. $500. And you told the seller honestly that it might be worth more. I told her I'd let her know either way. Ferdinand nodded slowly. He looked back at the car. You have an unusual problem, Logan. Yeah. The authentication process will take time. During that time, this car needs to be secured and insured and documented with extreme care, and you'll need resources to do the authentication properly. He paused. And you'll need to make a decision about what you owe the woman who sold it to you. I already made that decision. Ferdinand looked at him. You haven't seen the numbers yet. Doesn't matter. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father was a mechanic, you told me once. Body shop, yeah. He taught you about cars? He taught me to not cut corners. Well, Logan looked at the car. said the shortcuts always show up eventually. Always. Ferdinand nodded. He picked up his bag. I'll start the authentication process this week. I'll pull my factory records archive, contact my colleagues in Maranello, and I'd suggest you contact the auction house specialist I worked with at Bonham's, Claudia Reyes. She deals in exactly this category of car, and she's connected to the kind of buyers who can make this move quickly and cleanly when the time comes. How quickly? Ferdinand shrugged, pulling on his jacket. Authentication, documentation, finding the right buyer? 6 months minimum if everything goes smoothly. Could be a year. Logan walked him to his Volvo. Ferdinand paused before getting in. One more thing, he said. The fire. 3 years ago, you said? That's what the seller said. Insurance adjuster came out and assessed it. And valued it at? Essentially zero. Total loss. Ferdinand looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Something between professional skepticism and the particular wariness of a man who'd seen things in his career that had taught him not to be surprised by human behavior. Who was the adjuster? He said. I don't know yet. Ferdinand nodded slowly, got into his car. Find out, he said through the window. He drove away down the cracked asphalt parking lot, the Volvo exhaust putting a thin blue trail in the morning air. Logan stood in the parking lot for a moment. Then he went back inside and started making phone calls. The Ashford estate attorney was a woman named Patricia Chen, who was efficient, slightly overworked, and not particularly interested in helping a car mechanic dig through 3-year-old estate records. Logan had to explain himself twice and then leave his number and wait 2 days before she called back. Mr. Hayes, she said, you understand that most of these records are confidential. I understand that. I'm not asking for financial records. I'm asking for the adjuster's name from the fire damage claim, and the name of the insurance company. It's relevant to the car I purchased. There may be a title issue. That last part was slightly invented, but title issues were the kind of thing attorneys understood to be real problems, and it worked. Patricia Chen found the information with an audible sigh and gave it to him. The insurance company was Coastal Heritage Group. The adjuster's name was Dale Merritt. Logan wrote both down and stared at them. He ran the name through everything he could access from his shop. Not a lot, but enough to get a basic picture. Dale Merritt was 47, had been an independent insurance adjuster for 22 years, operated out of a small office in Fort Lauderdale. His public professional record was unremarkable. Licensed, no disciplinary actions that Logan could find, a list of companies he'd done adjustment work for that read like a who's who of mid-size Florida insurers. Nothing red-flagged, nothing obvious. But he found something else, almost by accident, in a regional business database he used for tracking collector car sales. 3 years ago, around the time of the Ashford fire, a fire-damaged Italian sports car, listed only as damaged European sports car project vehicle, had appeared briefly at an estate liquidation in Fort Lauderdale and sold for $3,800 to a private buyer. No make, no model listed in the public record. The buyer's name wasn't listed. The seller was a company, MHR Holdings, LLC. Logan looked up MHR Holdings, LLC. It was a Florida limited liability company registered 3.5 years ago. Its registered agent was an attorney in Dade County. Its managing member, listed in the original registration documents, was Dale Merritt. Logan sat with that for a long time. He called Ferdinand. The adjuster who assessed the car 3 years ago, he said. Dale Merritt. He has a company called MHR Holdings. About 3 months after the Ashford fire, that company sold a fire-damaged Italian car through a liquidator in Fort Lauderdale. Ferdinand was quiet for a moment. The car you have is the right car, he said. I've been into the factory records. The chassis numbers match a documented vehicle. It wasn't sold to a liquidator in Fort Lauderdale. No, Logan said. It wasn't. It was sitting in a garage in Coral Gables for 3 years under a tarp. Because someone told the insurance company it was worthless, and then was waiting for the estate to clear before he made his move. Another silence. Logan, Ferdinand said carefully, what you're describing is a serious federal crime. Insurance fraud on a luxury asset, potentially conspiracy. You understand that what you do next matters a great deal. I know. You could walk away. You have legal title. The car is yours. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, and Logan could hear Ferdinand breathing on the other end. There are people who would tell you, Ferdinand said slowly, that you paid a fair price for what was offered to you, that the seller accepted the terms, that what happened before you were involved is not your responsibility. Are you one of those people? A pause. No, Ferdinand said, but I wanted to make sure you'd thought about it. I've thought about it. Logan looked at the car. I need to document everything, every photograph, every number, every conversation. Before I contact anyone official, I need the authentication complete and the paper trail solid. Agreed. Can you accelerate the authentication? I can try. Ferdinand paused. And Logan, be careful. If Merritt realizes the car has been sold before he could act, and if he realizes who you are and what you know, I know. Men who've built a fraud over 3 years don't respond to exposure quietly. I know, Ferdinand. He spent the next week working during the day and documenting at night, building a file that was meticulous in the way that his grandfather had taught him to build things. Foundation first, everything square, no shortcuts that would show up later. The car sat under its tarp in the back of the shop while he worked. Caleb came to the shop after school sometimes and did his homework on the old couch in the corner while Logan worked on other cars. One afternoon, the boy looked up from his reading and said, "Dad, what's under the tarp in the back?" "Something I'm figuring out." "Is it the thing from last week? The expensive thing?" Logan paused his work. "How do you know it might be expensive?" Caleb shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 7-year-old concealing intelligence. "You've been up late a lot, and you're not worrying about money as much." Logan looked at his son for a moment. "How do you know I was worrying about money?" "Because you stopped worrying about it," Caleb said, matter-of-factly, and went back to his book. Logan stood in the middle of his shop, holding a wrench, looking at his kid. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It might be expensive. We'll see." "Okay." Caleb turned a page. "It's going to be good, Dad." "You don't know that." "I know you." He said it simply without looking up. "So yeah, it's going to be good." Logan turned back to his work. Outside, a Florida afternoon was doing what Florida afternoons do in October, turning the light amber and sideways, sending long shadows across the cracked asphalt, the air just starting to concede that summer was finally over. In the back of the shop, under a gray canvas tarp, a car that had been waiting 3 years for someone to find it sat in the quiet. It had a little longer to wait. End of part 1. Ferdinand's full authentication report arrived on a Tuesday morning, 23 days after he'd first walked around the car in Logan's shop. It came as a PDF attached to an email with no subject line, just the attachment and a single sentence in the body, "Call me when you've read it." Logan read it at the kitchen table before Caleb woke up, in the gray early light with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and by the time he finished, he had to set the document down and sit with his hands flat on the table for a while. The report was 41 pages. 41 pages of cross-reference chassis numbers, factory production records sourced from Maranello's archives, body panel stampings, corroborating documentation from 3 independent Ferrari historians, and a final section titled Authentication Conclusion that Ferdinand had written in the careful, hedged language of a professional who'd learned that absolute certainty was a liability in legal proceedings, but whose meaning, stripped of its qualifications, was unambiguous. The car was real, not approximately real, not probably real. The chassis numbers matched production records for a 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO, serial number 4153 GT, which had last been formally documented in a private sale in Geneva in 1991. Since then, its whereabouts had been listed in the Ferrari authentication community as unknown. There were 17 documented surviving examples of the model. The location of several others was a matter of ongoing academic and legal dispute. This car, burned, charred, stripped of its paint and its interior and most of its cosmetic identity, was one of them. Logan called Ferdinand at 6:15 in the morning. "You read it," Ferdinand said. He didn't sound like he'd been asleep. All of it. And? The 1991 Geneva sale. Can we trace the chain from there to Ashford? I've already started. There was an intermediary, a private dealer in Monaco, now deceased. His estate records are accessible, partially. I have a colleague in Nice who is pursuing them. Ferdinand paused. It will take some weeks, but Logan, the physical evidence is enough to begin. A serious buyer in this market does not wait for a perfect document chain. They conduct their own due diligence. They have the resources. Claudia Reyes. I've already spoken to her. She's aware there's something significant in play, though I didn't give her specifics. She's prepared to fly down from New York when you're ready. Logan looked across the kitchen at the window, where the morning light was coming through the old Venetian blinds and laying its pattern across the floor. He could hear Caleb moving around upstairs, the particular sound of a 7-year-old who'd just woken up, shuffling feet, the thump of something falling off a bed. Ferdinand, he said, before Claudia, before any buyers, I need to deal with Merritt. A short silence. I assumed you'd say that. I've got more on him. I spent the last 3 weeks building the file. The MHR Holdings connection, the timing of the Fort Lauderdale sale. I tracked down 2 other estate claims he adjusted in the past 7 years. Both involved high-value vehicles that were assessed at near zero and subsequently appeared in private sales through entities with loose connections to him. You've been busy. I've also been careful. Everything I have is documented, photographed, dated. I haven't touched anything I wasn't legally entitled to access. He paused. I want to take it to federal investigators. Not local. Federal. This is insurance fraud across multiple claims, potentially across state lines. That's FBI territory. Yes, Ferdinand said quietly. It is. But before I do that, I need to tell Victoria Ashford what I found. All of it. She deserves to know before anyone else does. Ferdinand was silent for a moment. Then, you understand that telling her complicates your position. She could make a claim against the sale, argue she didn't have full information when she set the price. I know. You paid $500 for a car that is worth, conservatively, in its current condition, given the rarity, somewhere between $10 and $15 million. I know what it's worth, Ferdinand. And you're going to call the woman you bought it from and tell her that. I told her I would. Another silence. When Ferdinand spoke again, his voice had something in it that wasn't quite sentiment, but was adjacent to it. The sound of a man who'd spent a long career watching other people make convenient decisions and was unaccustomed to the alternative. All right, he said simply. Let me know how it goes. Logan sat with the phone in his hand after he hung up. Above him, the shuffling had become footsteps on the stairs. Caleb's particular rhythm, 1-2 pause, 1-2 pause, the way he always came downstairs like he was counting them. The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, hair sideways, rust limping along behind him. He looked at Logan's face with the unsettling accuracy of a kid who'd spent years reading a parent's emotional weather. Something happened, Caleb said. It was not a question. Something happened, Logan confirmed. Caleb came to the table and sat down across from him, pulling his knees up the way he did. Good something or bad something? Logan thought about that. Both. Mostly good, I think, but it's complicated. Is it the tarp car? Yeah, it's the tarp car. Caleb nodded with the gravity of someone who'd been waiting for this. How much? Logan looked at his son. 7 years old, serious eyes, the ability to cut directly to the relevant question. He'd gotten that from his mother, probably, or maybe it skipped a generation. Logan's own father had been a man of few words and even fewer direct questions, a man who communicated in actions rather than language. A lot, Logan said. More than I can really make you understand right now. Caleb processed that. Are we going to be okay? We're going to be better than okay. Better than okay how? Better than okay in ways that I need to figure out before I can explain. But yeah, better. Logan reached across the table and ruffled his son's hair, which Caleb submitted to with the dignified tolerance of a child who hadn't yet decided whether he was too old for that. Go get dressed. You're going to be late. After he dropped Caleb at school, Logan sat in the truck in the drop-off lane for longer than was strictly necessary, watching the last of the morning arrivals file through the double doors. He watched a woman chase her daughter across the sidewalk with a forgotten lunch bag, watched two kids nearly collide on their bikes in the parking lot and dissolve into laughter instead of tears, watched a father in a work shirt lift a toddler and carry her to the door with the slightly desperate tenderness of someone who had to leave in 5 minutes and wasn't ready to. He thought about what it would mean to do the right thing when the wrong thing was legal, when you could, technically, keep everything. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove south toward Coral Gables. He hadn't called ahead. He probably should have, but he didn't want to give himself the opportunity to change his mind or to rehearse what he was going to say until it came out polished and detached. He wanted to say it the way it needed to be said, which was plainly, with the actual weight of it, not smoothed over. The iron gate at the Ashford estate was open again. He drove through and parked in the wide, crushed-shell driveway. The morning was warm and slightly overcast, the light flat and gray, and the live oak out front was moving slightly in a wind off the bay. He rang the bell. Victoria answered after about a minute. She was in work clothes this time, so she'd apparently been doing something administrative because she was holding a pen and there was a small ink mark on the back of her left hand. She looked at him with the expression of someone who wasn't expecting company but was too composed to show surprise in any obvious way. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I didn't expect— Is something wrong with the title?" "No, the title's fine." He paused. "I need to talk to you. I'm sorry for coming without calling." She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face, probably, the way she'd read him at their first meeting. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." She led him through the front of the house into a sitting room off the main hall, a room that felt like it had been used rarely and carefully, with the faintly preserved quality of a place where someone old and deliberate had spent time. There were books on shelves along one wall, and a framed photograph on the desk that Logan didn't look at directly. She sat in a chair with her back to the window and didn't offer him coffee, which he took as an unconscious signal that she'd registered the gravity of whatever was coming. "Tell me," she said. He told her, all of it. He'd thought about how to organize it on the drive over and had decided that the right order was chronological, starting with the physical examination, Ferdinand's involvement, the authentication process, and then the financial reality of what the car was. He kept his voice level and let the information land without cushioning it or editorializing. When he got to the number, the conservative low-end estimate of $10 million, the realistic current market for a verified GTO in any condition, Victoria's expression did something complicated. She didn't react the way people react in movies, no sharp intake of breath, no dramatic shift. She went very still, the way people go still when something large is happening and the body recognizes it before the mind catches up. He kept going. The insurance adjuster, Dale Merritt, the MHR Holdings LLC, the timing that placed Merritt's company in possession of a fire-damaged Italian vehicle 3 months after the Ashford fire, 3 years before the estate fully settled. He was waiting, Logan said, for the estate process to close. Once the property transferred and the old insurance claim was settled, there'd be no one looking at that car anymore. He could approach whoever ended up with it, maybe another low-ball offer, maybe a different play, and either acquire it or ensure it disappeared into a private collection without anyone asking questions. Victoria had not moved for the last 5 minutes. She was looking at something past Logan's shoulder, the middle distance, and her hands were folded in her lap with a controlled stillness that he recognized as someone keeping themselves together by pure structure. "My grandfather insured it," she said. "Yes. He insured everything. He trusted—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Merritt assessed it 3 years ago." 20 minutes, you said. He was here 20 minutes. He shook my hand. He told me he was sorry for our loss. He said the car was a shame, that it had probably been nice once, and it was a shame what the fire did. Her voice had gone flat and careful in the way of someone who's just understood fully that they were deceived by someone performing sympathy. He recommended we remove it for scrap as soon as the claim processed, said there was no point keeping it. Logan didn't say anything. Victoria looked at him directly for the first time since he'd started talking. "You drove an hour for a $500 listing," she said slowly, Because of the shape of the front end in a blurry photograph. Yes. And he was here for 20 minutes and told us it was garbage. He knew what it was. He'd have done his research before he came. He came knowing, assessed it at zero so the insurance company wouldn't pay out a claim that would attract scrutiny, and then planned to come back for it once everyone stopped paying attention. She was quiet for a moment. How much did my grandfather collect on the insurance claim? I don't have that figure. You'd have access to the estate records. It was almost nothing. Her voice had gone somewhere new, not louder, almost quieter. I remember thinking it was strange. Grandfather had the car insured, we knew that, and when the claim came back it was, I want to say 40 or 50,000, which seemed low even for a damaged vehicle. Patricia told me it was because the adjuster had assessed the car as having no salvage value, so the payout was only the policy minimum. She paused. $50,000. That's what they gave us for something worth $10 million. The fraud was sophisticated, Logan said. He would have known the policy terms, known exactly how to structure his assessment to maximize the payout to him and minimize what the insurer had to pay you. 50,000, she said again, like she was making sure the number was real. I'm sorry, Logan said. He meant it without ceremony. I'm sorry this happened to your family, and I'm sorry I'm the one sitting here telling you. Victoria stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the overgrown garden, and Logan gave her the time to do that. Why are you here? She said finally. Her voice was controlled, but the control was costing her something. You legally bought the car. You paid what I asked. You didn't do anything wrong. You could have taken the authentication report, sold the car, and I never would have known. You would have known eventually, when the investigation started. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe it all stays quiet. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. You're here because you said you'd tell me, not because you had to. Yes. And what do you want to do about it? He'd thought about how to say this too. I want to contact federal investigators with the documentation I have on Merritt. I want them to open an investigation. I think when they do, they'll find more than just the Ashford claim. 2 other cases I found are probably the beginning, not the whole picture. He paused. And before any of that, before the sale, I want to give you a share of what the car brings, a meaningful share. The room was quiet for a moment. You want to give me money for a car you legally own, Victoria said. I want to make you whole for what your family lost to fraud. The legal question and the right question aren't the same question. She looked at him for a long time. It was the same assessment she'd made in the garage, the same calculation. Not about money, about whether he was real, whether people like this actually existed or whether he was something else wearing the face of honesty. My grandfather, she said slowly, used to say that a man's character was most visible when he had something to gain by lying. Not in the small moments, in the moments when the lie would cost him nothing and the truth would cost him a great deal. Logan didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say. All right, Victoria said. She sat back down. Tell me what you need from me. What he needed was access to estate records, to the original insurance claim documentation, to anything that had Merritt's signature or assessment reports from the time of the fire. Victoria spent the next 2 hours going through filing cabinets in her grandfather's study, with Logan sitting across the desk while she pulled folders and read them and handed him the relevant ones. The study was a room that felt like Edward Ashford, dense with books and objects, the desk surface scarred from decades of use, a smell of old paper and something faintly cedar that Logan recognized as the smell of a man who'd lived in one house long enough to leave his scent in it. She found the claim file in the 3rd cabinet, in a hanging folder labeled Insurance, Property, with a series of policy numbers underneath. The file contained the original claim filing, the adjuster's assessment report, the payout letter from the insurer, and a carbon copy of a signed acknowledgement form. Dale Merritt's signature was on 3 pages. Logan photographed every document carefully, then photographed them again with his other phone as a backup. Victoria watched him without comment. At some point, she went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee, handing him one without asking how he took it, black, which happened to be correct. The other claims you mentioned, she said while he worked, the 2 other cases. Different estates, different locations, same pattern. High-value vehicle in a fire or flood damage scenario, assessed at essentially zero, subsequently appearing in a private sale at a low price through a company connected to Merit. He looked up from the documents. Those families have probably never known. Will they know now? If the investigation goes where I think it goes, yes, they'd be entitled to restitution. She was quiet for a moment, her coffee cup in both hands. That matters to you. Doesn't it matter to you? She looked at him. Yes. I was just noting that it matters to you in a way that… She stopped. Most people who found what you found would be thinking about one thing, the sale, getting through the authentication and closing the deal and depositing the money. I'm thinking about that too, Logan said. I'm not pretending otherwise. That's honest. I told you I would be. She almost smiled at that. Almost. You did. The meeting with Claudia Reyes happened 10 days later at the shop, which Logan had cleaned more thoroughly than usual and then felt vaguely embarrassed about, like he was trying to impress someone by making his workspace look like it wasn't a working garage, which was both impossible and counterproductive since the whole point of the meeting was a car that was stored there. Claudia Reyes was 50, Cuban-American, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in rooms full of very wealthy people and had decided early on that the way to survive that environment was to be more competent than all of them and let that competence be the only thing that mattered. She shook Logan's hand firmly, shook Victoria's hand, and then spent 25 minutes with the car before speaking a word about it. When she was done, she straightened up and looked at both of them. You're going to want to hear two numbers, she said. Tell me, Logan said. Conservative estimate for a private sale, current authentication status, condition as is, 11 million. This assumes a buyer who understands the market and accepts that restoration will be needed. She paused. High-end estimate, right buyer at the right moment, 14 to 16 million. There are 3 or 4 individuals in the world who have been quietly searching for any documented GTO example that comes available. One of them is a member of a Gulf royal family whose representative contacted my firm 18 months ago. They have essentially limitless budget. Their interest is specifically in cars with documented but contested provenance. They prefer to do their own restoration, their own authentication layering. It's a point of pride. The room was quiet for a moment. What's your recommendation? Victoria asked. Claudia glanced at her, then back at Logan, understanding instinctively, Logan thought, that this was his call. I recommend a targeted private approach to the 3 most serious buyers I know in this category. No public auction. A public auction generates publicity that you may not want given, she paused, given whatever else is unfolding here. Private sale is faster, cleaner, and achieves essentially the same price ceiling with the right buyers. How long? If I approach them this week, 3 to 6 weeks to close. These are buyers who've been waiting. They don't need convincing. They need verification. Logan looked at Victoria. She was looking at him. Something passed between them that wasn't a conversation exactly. More like 2 people who've been through something unusual together, arriving at the same point at the same time. Do it, he said. After Claudia left, Logan and Victoria stood in the parking lot in the warm afternoon, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The light had gone golden in the way it does in Florida in November, low and warm and making everything look slightly more significant than it is. I've been thinking about what you said, Victoria said, about giving my family a share. I meant it. 4 million, she said. He looked at her. You're setting the number? It's approximately what the difference would have been between the insurance payout and a fair pre-fire valuation. If the car had been assessed correctly 3 years ago, even conservatively, we'd have collected something in that range. She paused. It doesn't fully account for what was taken, but it's the number that makes sense to me. Logan thought about $4 million. He thought about what 10 million felt like in comparison, which was still a number so far outside his previous reality that it existed almost in the abstract, like a figure in a news story about someone else's life. He thought about the $500 he'd counted out in her parking area and the way she'd handed him the handwritten receipt. 4 million, he said. Okay. She nodded. I want to be involved in the federal investigation, not as a bystander, as an active participant. I have resources and an attorney who knows how to use them. If there are other families affected by this, I want to help find them. Yeah, Logan said. I figured you'd say something like that. Was that predictable? It was consistent. He looked at her. Your grandfather, the journal you mentioned, did he write about the car? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Some. He wrote about what it represented to him, more than the object itself. He'd bought it in the late 80s when the company was going through a difficult period, and he'd made a decision that cost a friend of his a great deal. He kept the car, I think, as a kind of reminder of what it feels like to make the right call when the wrong call is easier. Logan looked at the shop, at the sign with his name on it that he'd hand-painted 6 years ago, at the cracked asphalt and the strip of dead grass, at the double doors standing open to the afternoon. I need to call my federal contact, he said. I know. And then I need to pick up my kid from school. She looked at him, and this time the thing that crossed her face was something he hadn't seen from her before. Something unguarded, something that wasn't calculation or assessment or the careful neutrality of a person managing a complicated situation. It was the look of someone who is genuinely, unexpectedly moved by another person. You're going to be all right, Logan Hayes, she said. He almost said something dismissive. Almost. Instead, he just looked at her for a moment and said, Yeah, I think so. He called his FBI contact, a contact he'd gotten through a retired customs agent he'd done work for 2 years earlier, from the parking lot of Caleb's school while waiting for dismissal. His name was Special Agent Daniel Rios. Rios answered on the second ring, and Logan talked for 12 minutes without stopping, the words coming out organized and clear the way they do when you've been thinking about what to say for 3 weeks and finally have permission to say it. When he finished, there was a pause. You've been building this documentation on your own? Rios said. Yes. For 3 weeks. 23 days. Another pause. Okay, Rios said. Don't touch anything else. Don't contact Merritt directly under any circumstances. Get me copies of everything you have by end of day. A slight change in his voice, something between professional respect and the particular wariness of a federal agent who'd been surprised by a civilian. You understand you may be required to testify. I understand. And the car is secured? Physically secured? It's in my shop. The shop has a lock I upgraded 3 weeks ago when this started. He paused. And a German Shepherd mix at the neighbor's house who has standing instructions to come over if anyone messes with my property. Rios was quiet for a moment. You don't have a German Shepherd. No, but Mrs. Fernandez does, and she's very protective of the general area. The school doors opened and kids started streaming out. Logan watched the tide of backpacks and energy, scanning for Caleb's dark hair, the blue jacket. There he was, appearing in the second wave of kids, looking around the parking lot with the slight frown of someone who takes the task of locating his ride seriously. When he spotted Logan's truck, he broke into a run, which he tried to modulate back into a walk when he got close, in a way that was completely transparent. Agent Rios, Logan said, I'll have everything to you within the hour. Thank you. He ended the call as Caleb yanked open the passenger door and climbed in, dropping his backpack on the floor and immediately launching into a detailed account of something that had happened at lunch involving Marcus, a juice box, and a considerable misunderstanding about whose territory the corner bench represented. Logan listened. He drove. He asked the right follow-up questions. Somewhere in Fort Lauderdale, Dale Merritt was going about his Tuesday. He didn't know yet that a single blurry photograph had unraveled 3 years of careful planning. He didn't know that the car he'd expected to quietly acquire had instead been bought by a mechanic from Palmetto Bay who'd learned from his father that shortcuts always show up eventually. He didn't know that an FBI agent was about to have a very interesting afternoon reviewing 23 days of carefully documented evidence. He would know soon enough. In the truck, Caleb concluded his account of the lunch incident and then looked out the window at the Florida afternoon passing by. Dad, he said after a while, are we getting new tires? Logan glanced at him. What? The back tires. You said months ago they needed replacing. Yeah, Logan said. Yeah, Cal, we're getting new tires. Good, Caleb said. I've been worried about that. Logan looked at the road ahead and said nothing for a moment. The late afternoon sun was in his eyes, and he reached up to pull the visor down. "Me too, bud," he said. "Me too." The call from Claudia Reyes came on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after she'd walked out of Logan's shop and back into the world of people who moved money in amounts that didn't require them to think about it. Logan was underneath a '71 Chevelle at the time, tracing a brake line, and he had to slide out on the creeper with grease on his forearms and his back complaining about the concrete floor. He'd been sleeping badly. Not from anxiety exactly, or not only from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of a man who has too many open variables and a habit of running them at 3 in the morning instead of sleeping through them. The FBI investigation had been moving, though moving in federal terms meant something different than it did in normal life. Agent Rios had called twice in 2 weeks. Professional, measured, telling Logan what he needed to know and nothing more. Merritt had not been contacted yet. The Bureau was building its case, pulling financial records, cross-referencing the other estate claims Logan had flagged. "These things take the time they take," Rios had said, which was the federal version of "be patient," which Logan was finding approximately as easy as it sounded. He'd also had a conversation with Merritt. Or rather, Merritt had initiated one. It had happened 6 days after Logan contacted the FBI, which meant it had happened before Rios's team had finished their preliminary work, which meant Merritt had somehow gotten wind that something was wrong before the investigation officially touched him. Logan had been at the shop, late, alone, when his cell phone rang from an unknown number. He'd almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him pick up. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice was even, pleasant in the way of a man who'd spent years professionally managing other people's stress. "My name is Dale Merritt. I'm an independent insurance adjuster. I believe you've recently acquired a vehicle that I assessed some years ago as part of a claim." Logan had gone very still. He'd moved to the corner of the shop, away from the car, and stood with his back to the wall in the instinctive way of someone wanting a clear sightline. "I remember the vehicle," Logan said, keeping his voice completely neutral. "Good. I was hoping we could have a conversation, professional to professional. I understand you have some interest in the car's history, its authentication, possibly its value." A slight pause. "I have information that might be relevant to your situation." "What kind of information?" "The kind that's better discussed in person." Another pause. "I don't think we have competing interests here, Mr. Hayes. I think there's an arrangement that benefits both of us." Logan had spent approximately 4 seconds deciding how to respond. "I'm happy to meet," he said. "Call me tomorrow and we'll set something up." He'd hung up and called Rios immediately. Rios had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't meet with him alone. Don't meet with him without notifying me first. And don't, under any circumstances, agree to anything, acknowledge anything, or indicate in any way that you've been in contact with federal investigators." "I know." "I mean it, Hayes. This man has been doing this for 20 years. He's very good at reading people and very good at constructing conversations that later sound, on a recording, like the other person was a willing participant. He's going to try to buy my silence, or threaten your cooperation, or both, in the same conversation, framed in a way that gives him plausible deniability on the threat." Rios paused. "He called you, which means he knows more than he should about the car's current status. That's concerning. It means he has a source somewhere, possibly in the authentication community, possibly in the estate settlement process. Be careful who you talk to." Logan had thought about Ferdinand, about Claudia, about Patricia Chen, the estate attorney. "Set up the meeting," Rios said. "We'll figure out how to handle it." What they'd figured out was that Logan would meet Merritt in a public place, a coffee shop in Coral Gables that Rios's team selected, a place with enough ambient noise to make casual surveillance difficult and enough visibility to prevent anything that required privacy. Logan would wear nothing unusual. He would say nothing incriminating and agree to nothing specific. The goal was to let Merritt show his hand without giving him anything to grab. That meeting had happened 5 days ago. Merritt was not what Logan had constructed in his head. He'd imagined someone obviously unpleasant, the kind of face that announces its dishonesty, the cold eyes of a man comfortable with cruelty. What he got instead was a man who looked like someone's fairly likable uncle, thick in the middle, white-haired, with an open face and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a handshake that was warm and firm and entirely convincing. They'd sat across from each other at a corner table with coffees neither of them drank, and Merritt had leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who was not, as far as his posture was concerned, doing anything unusual. "Here's what I'd like you to understand," Merritt had said. "The assessment I did on that vehicle 3 years ago was conducted in good faith under difficult conditions. Fire damage is notoriously hard to evaluate. I stand behind my professional judgment." "Okay," Logan said. "Now, what I also understand is that you may have, through your own expertise, which I gather is considerable, come to a different conclusion about the vehicle's value." He tilted his head slightly. "That's not a conflict. Experts disagree. Markets change. Values are subjective in a category like this. They're less subjective when there are factory records and an authentication committee," Logan said. A slight pause. Something moved across Merritt's face. Not fear, exactly, more the recalibration of a man adjusting to new information about the person across from him. "Fair point," he said, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the warmth dialing down a fraction. "Let me be more direct then. Please. You've acquired an asset that has complicated history. Authentication on a vehicle like this, a disputed chassis, documented provenance gap, is a lengthy and expensive process, and the outcome is never guaranteed. There are individuals in the authentication community who can make that process significantly more difficult." He said it pleasantly, the way you discuss weather. "I have relationships in that community. I have relationships with insurance regulators. I have relationships with estate attorneys." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm suggesting that I could be a useful ally rather than a complicating factor." Logan looked at him across the table. "And what would make you a useful ally rather than a complicating factor?" "A fair acknowledgement that we've both been in this situation. You found something valuable. I assessed it under difficult conditions. Outcomes differed. Reasonable people can see how that happens." Another pause. "And a reasonable arrangement. Something that reflects the complexity of the situation." "A number," Logan said. Merritt spread his hands slightly. "I'm flexible." Logan had looked at this man, at the reading glasses and the warm handshake and the 2 decades of practiced pleasantness, and felt something settle in his chest, not anger, something colder than anger. The clarity that comes when you stop being uncertain about what you're dealing with. "I'll think about it," Logan said. He'd called Rios from the parking lot. Rios had listened to the recorded audio. Logan had been wired, a fact that Merritt would eventually learn and that would later be described in the federal charging documents as a recorded solicitation of payment for the suppression of evidence of insurance fraud. The charges would be multiple and federal and would involve penalties that the pleasantness of Merritt's handshake would do nothing to soften. But that was still coming. On the Wednesday morning, when Claudia Reyes called, the investigation was grinding forward in the background of Logan's days, and what Claudia had was different news entirely. "The buyer is ready," she said. "His representative contacted me this morning. They've reviewed Ferdinand's authentication report and their own team's supplementary findings. They want to move." Logan set down the brake line fitting he'd been holding. "What's the number?" $14 million, Claudia said. "Even. They're not negotiating. They said the number reflects the rarity, the documentation status, and their interest in conducting the restoration themselves. They consider the current condition a feature, not a liability." $14 million. The number existed in Logan's mind as something almost abstract, a figure that belonged to a different category of reality than his cracked asphalt parking lot and his hand-painted sign and the Chevelle he'd been lying under. "Timeline?" he said. "They want to close within 30 days. Wire transfer, no financing contingency. Their team will arrange transport from your location." "Okay," Logan said. "Logan," Claudia's voice shifted slightly. "You understand this is real." "I'm starting to. $14 million is real. This is happening." A pause, and he could hear in her voice the professional discipline of a woman who'd done this many times and had trained herself not to make it personal, and also the faint crack in that discipline, because some things are too large to be purely professional. You drove an hour for a $500 listing. I want you to know, I've been in this business for 22 years, and I've never... She stopped. It's a good story, Hayes. It's not done yet, he said. No, but this part is. He stood in the middle of his shop for a few minutes after he hung up. Rust was in his usual spot near the door, chin on his paws, watching Logan with the patient attention of a dog who'd learned that the humans sometimes needed to stand still and be quiet for a while, and that the correct response to this was to be nearby without demanding anything. Logan looked at the covered car in the back. In 2 weeks, it would be gone. Someone would come with a transport truck and load it carefully, and it would go wherever $14 million things go, to a restoration facility, probably, staffed by people whose entire professional lives were dedicated to returning rare objects to the condition they deserved. The burned paint and the warped frame and the melted interior would be addressed by hands more specialized than Logan's, and eventually the car would exist again as the thing it had been before the fire, before merit, before 3 years under a tarp in a damaged garage. He didn't feel the loss of it the way he might have expected. The car had never really been his in the way that the things he'd built or restored were his. It had been a discovery, not a creation. What it had given him was not the car itself, but everything that had happened because of it. And that was still in motion, still unresolved, still accumulating. He called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. He could hear traffic behind her. She was somewhere outside. I was going to call you, she said. Claudia called me, he said. 14 million, 30 days to close. A pause. Not a long one. All right. You said 4 million was the right number. I said 4 million was the number that made sense. It's still the number. Then that's what I'm transferring, after close. Logan, that's what I'm doing, Victoria. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the traffic on her end, horns somewhere distant, the sound of a city doing its ordinary business around a conversation that was anything but. Patricia is going to have complicated feelings about this, Victoria said. Your attorney can have whatever feelings she wants. It's a voluntary transfer between two adults. She'll say you're leaving money on the table, legally, ethically, in every way that attorneys care about. Probably, Logan sat on a shop stool. Is that going to change what you think about it? No. A pause. I'm at my grandfather's house. I came to look through more of his records. We've been pulling documentation for the federal case, and I found some things I want to show you. Can you come on Friday? Yeah, Friday works. He spent the next several days in a state of suspended animation, the sale processing through the layers of verification and legal review that moved at lawyer speed, the FBI case building in the background, Caleb going to school and coming home and eating dinner and doing homework as if the world were ordinary, which for Caleb it mostly still was, and which Logan was deliberately protecting. He hadn't told Caleb the number. He'd told him the car had sold, that things were going to change, that they were going to be all right. Caleb had nodded with the careful acceptance of a child who trusts his parents' word and has learned that the adult version of good news is delivered without fanfare, because adults have learned to be suspicious of things that feel too good. Are we going to move? Caleb had asked. What do you want to do? Caleb had thought about it seriously. I want to keep my school. And Marcus. We can do that. And Rust's vet, the one who does his leg. I want to keep her too. We can do that. Okay. Caleb had gone back to his book. Then we don't have to move. Logan had looked at his son and thought, this kid is going to be fine. Whatever else, whatever comes after, this kid is going to be absolutely fine. Friday came. He drove to Coral Gables in the late morning, and Victoria met him at the door of the main house with a slight distraction in her eyes that he'd come to recognize as the look she got when she'd been in the records for hours, and her brain was still there, even when her body had moved to the door. Come to the study, she said. The study had become familiar to Logan over the past weeks. The particular smell of it, the weight of the books on the shelves, the way the afternoon light came through the east window and hit the corner of Edward Ashford's desk at an angle that made the old wood look warm. He'd spent time here going through documents, and the room had stopped feeling like someone else's space and started feeling like a place where serious things got done carefully. Victoria had spread documents across the desk. Not the insurance records they'd been over before, but something different, older. She'd pulled a box from somewhere in the house, and the contents were arranged in the rough order she'd found them in. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I found the purchase records," she said, "from 1991, when grandfather bought the car." She laid a photocopy in front of him. The original was clearly fragile. The document was almost 35 years old, the paper yellowed, the typed text slightly uneven in the way of an actual typewriter. It was a private sale agreement from a dealer in Geneva, Switzerland, and the listed vehicle was, Logan read it twice, described in full, make and model and chassis number, with a transaction price that, adjusted for the decades between then and now, was consistent with what a serious collector would have paid for it at that time. He knew what he had, Logan said. He always knew. Victoria sat across from him. "I found something else." She put a second document in front of him. In the box, under the purchase records. This was with it. It was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, in a neat cursive that Logan recognized from other things he'd seen in the study as Edward Ashford's hand. It was addressed to Victoria, though it was undated in a way that suggested it had been written not with a specific time of delivery in mind, but simply as something that needed to be said. "Go ahead," Victoria said. "Read it." Logan read. The letter was not what he'd expected. He'd half imagined a rich man's instructions, what to do with the estate, how to manage the assets, the kind of practical legacy letter that people write when they're trying to control things after they're gone. It was nothing like that. It was written more like a man working something out, trying to explain himself to someone he loved, and wasn't sure he'd always been clear with. Edward Ashford wrote about the car, about why he'd bought it, which was not entirely about the car itself, but about a period in his life when he'd been building the company and had made decisions that had cost people he'd cared about. He wrote that keeping the GTO was his way of keeping something honest in his house, something that reminded him, every time he looked at it, that the things worth having were the things that had been honestly acquired and honestly maintained. He wrote, near the end of the letter, a single paragraph that Logan read twice. "The car will outlast me, and so will what it represents. What I hope for you, Victoria, is not that you become wealthy. You already are, and wealth is the least interesting thing about a person. But that you learn what I learned too late, that the character of the people around you is the only currency that actually appreciates. Find people who tell you the truth when lying would cost them nothing. Keep them close. Everything else can be replaced." Logan set the letter down. Victoria was watching him. Her expression was something he didn't have a name for. The particular look of a person who's been carrying something alone for a long time and has recently found that they don't have to. "He wrote that before the fire," she said, "before merit, before any of this." "Yeah," Logan said. "He didn't know that the car would end up being the thing that—" She stopped. Tried again. "I don't know what he'd think about how it all happened. I think he'd be okay with it." "Because it worked out?" Logan shook his head. "Because of what it took to make it work out." He picked up the letter carefully and set it back in front of her. "You should keep this somewhere safe. The investigators are going to want a complete picture of Ashford's relationship with the car. This is part of that picture." "I know." She took it gently. "I've been thinking about what comes after the sale, after the investigation." "What about it?" "The charity work my grandfather did. The estate has some foundation commitments that I've been managing. Automotive restoration programs for kids in underserved communities. He set them up 10 years ago." She paused. "I'd like to expand them, significantly. And I'd like to have someone involved who actually understands the work." Logan looked at her. "You're asking me something." "I'm floating an idea." "Well, float it more specifically." Victoria looked at him with the slight expression of someone who finds it both useful and occasionally annoying that the person they're talking to won't let things remain vague. "There's a facility in Overtown. The foundation has been funding it for 6 years. It teaches automotive skills to teenagers, mostly kids aging out of the foster system, kids without a lot of clear paths forward. The instructor retired last year and they've been making do." She paused. "I'd like to hire a proper director, someone who knows what they're doing and takes it seriously." "That's a full-time job," Logan said. "You'd keep your shop. The directorship would be part-time, consulting level, curriculum development, mentorship, some hands-on instruction. She paused again. You're about to have enough money that you don't have to take any job you don't want. I'm not offering this because I think you need the work. Then why are you offering it? She was quiet for a moment. Because my grandfather believed in it, and because I think you'd be good at it, and because, she looked at the letter in her hands, because some things should keep going. Logan thought about it. Not for long. I'll look at the program, he said. I'm not committing to anything before I see what's actually there and what it needs, but I'll look. That's all I'm asking. He drove back to Palmetto Bay with the windows down, the November air doing something reasonable for once. Not the suffocating heat of summer, but something with movement in it, something that felt like the world was breathing normally. He had a voicemail from Rios waiting, which he played through the truck's speaker. Hayes, wanted to give you a heads up. The financial records subpoena came back this morning, and what we're looking at is bigger than what you flagged. We've identified 8 separate estate claims over a 12-year period. Total fraudulent undervaluation in the neighborhood of $40 million in assets. Merritt's been running this as a structured operation. He's not working alone. There are 2 other adjusters connected to his network and a broker who's been moving the assets through private channels. A pause. This is going to be a significant case. You need to be prepared for your name to come up publicly. We'll try to manage that, but I want you to know it's a real possibility. Logan played the message twice, then he called Rios back. 8 claims, he said when Rios picked up. At minimum, we may find more as we go deeper. The other families, the ones affected by the other claims, they'll be notified. Restitution will be part of the resolution. It's going to take time, but yeah, everyone who was defrauded will have a path to recovery. Logan drove. The highway was moving well for once, and the city opened up around him. The particular sprawl of South Florida, the flat geography, the sky that was wide and high and very blue. When does it move? Logan asked. We're looking at executing the arrest warrants inside the next 2 weeks. I'd prefer it to be before your sale closes. I want Merritt's assets frozen before he realizes what's coming. Right now he thinks you're still considering his offer. He's been texting me, Logan said. Polite, patient. I know, we're monitoring. How much longer do I have to not respond? 10 days, maybe less. Rios paused. You've done your part, Hayes. The documentation you built is thorough enough that our financial forensics team called it the cleanest civilian-sourced evidence package they've seen in years. You should feel good about that. Logan thought about feeling good about it. Tried the feeling on. It didn't quite fit yet. Too much still in motion, too many moving pieces not yet settled. But the shape of it was right. The outline of it was right. Call me when you're ready to move, he said. The 10 days that followed were the strangest of Logan's life, which was saying something given the preceding 6 weeks. He went to work every day. He fixed cars that were not worth $14 million. He picked Caleb up from school. He took Russ to the vet for a routine visit and sat in the waiting room reading a 2-year-old sports magazine while the dog endured an examination with the dignified suffering of an animal who regarded all medical attention as a personal insult. He had dinner with Mrs. Fernandez, who had noticed over the past weeks that something was happening in Logan's life and was too polite to ask directly, but had begun making enough food for 2 people whenever she cooked, which was her version of support. He ate the food and was genuinely grateful for it. He went to Overtown one afternoon and looked at the automotive program Victoria had described. It was in a converted warehouse, real space, real tools, though some of the equipment was aging and the curriculum materials were outdated. There were 12 students currently enrolled between the ages of 15 and 19. The acting instructor was a retired mechanic named Howard, who was doing his best and knew he was out of his depth in the administrative side. Logan spent 2 hours there. He watched the students work. He helped one of them, a 16-year-old named Devin, who was trying to diagnose an ignition problem on a practice vehicle and was chasing the symptom instead of the system. Logan stood beside him and asked questions instead of giving answers, the way his father had done with him, and watched the kid's expression change when he found it himself. He drove back to the shop and called Victoria. "I'll do it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You looked at it." "I looked at it. It needs work. The curriculum is 15 years out of date and the equipment budget is a problem. But the students are real and the space is real, and Howard's trying. I know, that's why I want someone who... I said I'll do it, Logan said. We can work out the specifics after everything else settles. The call from Rios came on a Thursday morning at 7:45 while Logan was making breakfast. We're moving today, Rios said. Arrest warrants have been signed. We're executing simultaneously on Merritt and 2 associates at 9 a.m. I'm telling you now so you're not blindsided if it hits the news. Logan turned off the stove. Okay. The assets freeze goes into effect at the same time. Any communication he attempts to make with you after 9 a.m. should be forwarded to me immediately and not responded to. Understood. Logan. Rios used his first name for the first time in their entire professional relationship, which Logan noticed. I've been doing this for 16 years. What you built, the way you documented it, the discipline you showed in not tipping him off, the cooperation with the investigation, you made this case. I want you to know that. Logan looked at the stove where his eggs were sitting. Are you going to come tell me that in person or just on the phone? A pause. Probably just on the phone. That's fine. Thanks, Rios. He finished making breakfast. He called up the stairs for Caleb twice before the boy appeared, still pulling on his shirt, hair in the direction it had chosen overnight without any consultation. They ate together at the kitchen table, Rust stationed between them at floor level, with the eternal optimism of a dog who had never once received table scraps and remained convinced that today might be different. Caleb talked about a project his class was doing, something about Florida ecosystems, involving a poster that required more material about mangroves than Caleb felt was strictly reasonable. And Logan listened and asked questions and poured more juice and made a note to himself about mangrove research later. At 8:58, Logan looked at his phone. Then he set it face down on the table. You okay, Dad? Caleb asked. Yeah. Logan looked at his son. Something's going to happen today. Something I've been working on for a while. It's going to be okay, but it's going to be a lot. Caleb put his fork down and looked at him with full attention. The complete attentiveness of a kid who takes what his father says seriously. Good a lot or bad a lot? Both, probably. Mostly good. But complicated. Caleb thought about that. Is the person who did the bad thing going to get in trouble? Yeah, Logan said. Yeah, he is. The boy nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing information into a category he already understood, the category his 7-year-old brain had labeled how things are supposed to work. Good, Caleb said simply, and picked up his fork. At 9:04, Logan's phone lit up with a text from an unknown number, Merritt's number, a new one, different from the one he'd been using. The text was 3 words. We should talk. Logan forwarded it to Rios without responding, set his phone down, and helped his son put together a lunch that had a reasonable shot at making it to noon without being traded away for something else. The world outside was doing what it did, moving forward, indifferent to the things that felt enormous from the inside. Cars on the street, a sprinkler running somewhere down the block. A morning in Florida that was like other mornings, except that somewhere in Fort Lauderdale, a man with a warm handshake and 2 decades of careful fraud was learning that the game was over, and that a mechanic from Palmetto Bay with a creeper and a flashlight and a habit of looking at things carefully had been the one to end it. Logan drove Caleb to school, came back, and went to work. The Chevelle's brake line wasn't going to fix itself. The transport team arrived on a Tuesday. There were 4 of them, professionals from a specialized logistics company that moved things of this category, which was its own industry, its own world, with its own particular culture of competence and discretion. They arrived in 2 vehicles, a black SUV and a custom-enclosed transport trailer that cost more than Logan's house. They were polite, efficient, and did not waste words. The lead, a woman named Torres, shook Logan's hand and walked around the car twice before saying anything about it. Good storage conditions, she said, meaning the shop, which was about the highest compliment the space had ever received. Thanks, Logan said. They took 3 hours to load it. They used equipment Logan had never seen outside of industrial applications. Specialized dollies, a portable rail system, padding that was cut to specific curves like it had been made for this car, which it possibly had been. They worked without being told twice, and without dropping anything, and without the particular bravado that Logan associated with men who wanted you to know they were being careful. Logan stood in the corner of his shop and watched. He'd expected to feel something dramatic, the departure of a thing that had changed his life in ways still not fully visible. He'd expected weight to it, ceremony, the emotional equivalent of a slow-motion movie sequence. What he got instead was the ordinary texture of watching skilled people do skilled work, punctuated by the specific sadness of an empty space where something had been. Not grief exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a chapter ending, which is not always the same as the feeling of something being lost. When they were done and the trailer doors were sealed, Torres gave him a packet of documentation. Chain of custody forms, transport insurance certificates, a receipt that listed the vehicle with its full chassis number and authentication status, and shook his hand again. "Safe trip," Logan said, because he couldn't think of anything else that was accurate. Torres nodded once and got into the SUV, and the convoy pulled out of his parking lot and turned south on US 1 and was gone. Logan stood in the empty space in the back of his shop for a while. Rust came and sat beside him. The dog had an instinct for when standing still time was not about to become walking around time, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. Just present, just close, not asking for anything. Logan's phone rang. He looked at it. Victoria. "It's gone," he said when he picked up. "I know. Claudia's tracking the transport." A pause. "You okay?" "Yeah, you?" "I'm at grandfather's house, in the study." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep coming back here. I'm not sure if that's healthy or not." "Maybe both," Logan said. "Probably." Another pause. "The wire will clear in 72 hours. That's what Claudia said." "I know." "Logan, don't," he said. Not unkindly. "I was going to say thank you, not for the money, for the other thing." He understood what she meant, for coming back, for sitting in her grandfather's study and going through documents and not treating the truth like something negotiable just because the alternative was legal. "You don't have to thank me for that," he said. "I know I don't have to." She said it simply. "I'm doing it anyway." After he hung up, he called his bank. He had the number of a specific person there. He'd gotten a relationship manager, which was a new experience. Something that had happened 3 weeks ago when the pending transaction had shown up in his account profile, and the branch had called him to introduce themselves in the careful way of institutions that want to make sure they understand who they're dealing with. The manager's name was Karen, and she was professional and slightly formal, and did not at any point say anything about the amount of money that was about to move, which Logan appreciated more than any other quality she could have demonstrated. He asked Karen to schedule an appointment for the following week. There were things to discuss, not just the transfer to Victoria, but the larger shape of what came after. What you did with $10 million when you were a 32-year-old single father who lived in a house with a cracked driveway and a 3-legged dog. He didn't know yet. He had some ideas and a lot of uncertainty and the particular instinct of a man who'd lived carefully, not to suddenly live carelessly just because the constraints had changed. That night, after Caleb was in bed, Logan sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote things down. Not a budget. He didn't have enough information yet to make a budget that meant anything. More like a list of what mattered, in order. Caleb's future. Education, security, the ability to not worry in the ways Logan had worried. The house. Not a different house, necessarily. Caleb's school, Marcus, the vet who did Rust's leg. But repairs, real ones. The driveway. The water heater that had been operating on hope for 3 years. The roof that was going to need attention inside of 2 years and that Logan had been managing by not thinking about it. The shop. Not bigger, necessarily. Better. Equipment that was actually current. The ability to take on the kind of work he'd been turning away because he didn't have the throughput. The Miami dealer who'd said, "Come back when you have more capacity." Logan intended to make a phone call. The Overtown program. That was in a different category, not personal finances, but a commitment he'd made, which meant it went on the list and stayed there. He wrote Victoria's name and then felt slightly strange about having it on the same piece of paper as his household repairs, So he put a box around it that felt appropriately separate. He sat with the list for a long time, and then he folded it and put it in his wallet where it would be accessible. The 72 hours felt like longer. He worked. He did a full brake job on a customer's 1969 Camaro and rebuilt the carburetor on a TR4 that had been sitting in his lot for 6 weeks while the owner decided what he wanted done. He answered emails. He called his accountant, a man named Phil, who had been his accountant since the beginning of the business, who did taxes for 3 other small shops in the area, and whose office was wallpapered with car memorabilia in a way that had always felt to Logan like a man who wished he'd made different professional choices. Phil did not take Logan's call calmly. 14, Phil said once Logan had explained the outline. 14 million. After Claudia's commission and the authentication costs and legal fees, the net to me is approximately $10.3 million, Phil said, with the specific emphasis of a man verifying that a number is real by saying it aloud. Yes. And you're voluntarily transferring $4 million to the seller? Yes. A silence. Logan, I've done your taxes for 5 years. You wrote off a shop dog. Rust is a legitimate business expense. He's a security animal. He's a 3-legged terrier who is afraid of leaf blowers. Phil's voice had returned partway to its normal register. What do you need from me? I need to understand what I'm doing correctly and what I'm doing stupidly. Tax implications of the transfer, the structure of the primary income, what I should be doing with the shop financials going forward. Are you going to keep the shop? Yes. Good. Phil sounded genuinely relieved. You're good at what you do. Don't stop doing it just because you don't need to. I know. Can I ask the $4 million? To the seller. Why? Logan thought about how to answer that. Because it's right, he said. Phil was quiet for a moment. In 30 years of accounting, he said, I don't think I've ever had that be the answer to a money question. Maybe you've had better clients than you realized, and they just didn't tell you. Phil scheduled the appointment. After Logan hung up, he thought about what Phil had said. 30 years of accounting, and because it's right was unusual enough to note. He wasn't sure if that was a commentary on human nature or on accounting, and decided it was probably both. The wire cleared on a Friday morning at 10:47. Logan was in the shop when Karen from the bank called to confirm. He thanked her and hung up and sat on a shop stool for a minute. $10,300,000, approximately. Give or take the smaller numbers that accounting would eventually pin down precisely. In his account, real. Not a listing, not a promise, not a negotiation in progress. Real money in a real account with his name on it. He called his bank and authorized the transfer to Victoria. Then he called her. She answered on the first ring. It went through, she said before he could say anything. I know, I just sent it. A pause. Patricia is going to be in a state. Is Patricia going to call me? Possibly. I told her to direct her feelings at me instead, but she doesn't always listen. Victoria's voice was doing something careful. The same quality he'd noticed in their first conversation. The discipline underneath, but something else too now. Something that had shifted over the past weeks of sitting in her grandfather's study, going through documents together, and building a federal case and making decisions about what kind of people they intended to be. Logan. Yeah. Thank you. He told her not to thank him, and he didn't repeat it. Some things need to be said and received, not deflected. You're welcome, he said. They talked for a few more minutes. Logistics, mostly. The federal case was building. Rios had confirmed that the charges against Merritt included 8 counts of insurance fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and money laundering through the MHR Holdings entity. The 2 other adjusters in Merritt's network were cooperating with prosecutors, which meant the case against Merritt himself was becoming substantially more solid. His attorney had reportedly attempted to negotiate a plea in the first week after arrest and been told that the government wasn't interested in what Merritt was currently offering. Victoria's family attorney, Patricia Chen, who had moved through her complicated feelings about the $4 million transfer with impressive efficiency, had filed a civil suit against Merritt and his network on behalf of the Ashford estate. The civil case would run parallel to the criminal one, and the damages sought included the fraudulent undervaluation, interest compounded over 3 years, and legal costs. "It's not about the money," Victoria said about the civil suit. "I mean, it is partially, but it's more about making sure there's a complete record, that what he did has a name in a court document." "It will," Logan said. "How are you doing with the larger thing, the life has changed thing?" He thought about that honestly. "I'm still living the same week I've been living for a month. I keep expecting to feel different, and mostly I just feel like I need to fix a carburetor." "That's probably healthy," she said. "Or avoidant." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She paused. "I'll let you know when there are updates on the case. And I'll let you know when I've figured out the next thing." "Deal." The call from Rios came 2 weeks later, on a Monday afternoon. Logan had been at the Overtown facility. He'd started spending Tuesday and Thursday afternoons there, working with Howard on a revised curriculum framework, getting to know the students by name and by the particular ways they worked, which were as individual as any other form of intelligence. He stepped outside to take the call, standing in the alley behind the warehouse in the warm December afternoon. "The grand jury returned an indictment this morning," Rios said. "Merritt faces federal charges on all 8 fraud counts, the conspiracy charges, and the money laundering. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. Trial is likely to be 12 to 14 months out." The other victims, all 8 families have been formally notified. 4 of them have already retained attorneys. The DOJ is pushing for restitution as part of any eventual resolution, which means everyone who was defrauded has a viable path to recovery. Rios paused. "It's going to take time, but it's moving." Logan looked at the alley, at the wall of the warehouse across from him, at the strip of sky above it, at a cat sitting on top of a dumpster with the supreme indifference that cats bring to all human proceedings. "What about Merritt's assets?" he asked. "The freeze, is there enough there?" "Enough to make restitution meaningful, yes. He's been doing this for 12 years. There's real money." Rios paused. "He's not going to walk away from this financially comfortable. Between the criminal restitution and the civil suits, and there are 3 civil suits now, the Ashford estate and 2 other families who have already filed, he's going to be paying this for a long time." "Good," Logan said. He didn't say it with satisfaction exactly, more with the flat certainty of a man describing an appropriate outcome. "Logan?" Rios was quiet for a moment. "The U.S. Attorney's Office may want you to appear at sentencing, after the trial, assuming conviction. As a victim witness, you weren't technically a victim, but as the individual whose investigation initiated the case, it would be at your discretion." "I'll do it," Logan said. "You don't have to decide now." "I already decided. I'll do it." After he hung up, he went back inside and helped Devin, the 16-year-old he'd worked with on his first visit, diagnose a fuel delivery problem on the facility's practice Bronco. Devin had gotten better. Not in the way that students sometimes got better when a teacher was nearby and watching. Better in the way of someone who'd started to trust his own hands, who'd stopped waiting to be told, and started observing and concluding. It was a real thing, that kind of progress, and it was the most satisfying kind of work Logan knew how to do. December moved through its paces. The Florida version of December, which was not cold but was different. The light changed, the humidity dropped. The sky went a particular shade of blue that didn't exist in the other months. Logan took Caleb to the beach one Saturday morning, which they almost never did despite living 20 minutes from it, because somehow the proximate availability of beautiful things made them easier to defer. They went to the public access point at Crandon Park and walked at the waterline for an hour while Russ terrorized shorebirds with his ungainly 3-legged sprint. "Dad," Caleb said at some point, walking beside him with his shoes off and the wet sand coming up between his toes. "Are you happy?" Logan looked at his son. The question was genuine, not a probe for reassurance, but actual curiosity, the same curiosity Caleb brought to everything he didn't understand yet. "Yeah," Logan said. "I think so. Not done with things. There's still a lot happening, but yeah." "The courtroom thing," Caleb said. He'd absorbed over the past weeks The general outline of events in the way that smart kids absorb things from adult conversations. Not the details, but the shape, the emotional weather of it. That's still coming. The trial, yeah, that's going to take a while. Caleb considered that. Is it scary? Some of it. Are you going to have to stand up and talk in front of people? Maybe. Eventually. Yeah. I had to do that for the mangrove project, Caleb said. In front of the whole class. How was it? Bad at first, then okay, then actually kind of good. He shrugged with the philosophical ease of someone who'd processed the experience and filed it under manageable. You'll be okay. Logan looked at his kid, at the serious face and the salt spray hair and the feet leaving small prints in the wet sand. Yeah, he said, I'll be okay. That evening, after Caleb was in bed, Logan did something he'd been putting off. He went to the shop and stood in the space where the car had been. He hadn't really been back there since the transport, had been working around it, using the front two bays, leaving the back corner as a kind of unremarked absence. Now he stood in it deliberately and looked at the empty floor. The space needed a project. That was the only language his brain had for it. Not closure, not ceremony, just the practical reality that an empty bay in a working shop was a resource waiting to be used. He had 2 vehicles sitting in his lot that were waiting for him to have capacity. He had a '64 Mustang Fastback whose owner had been patient for 3 months. He had a Triumph TR6 that needed a full mechanical restoration, which was the kind of work he liked best. He stood in the empty space and decided what would go there. It was a decision that had nothing to do with $14 million and everything to do with who he'd been before the Ferrari appeared in a blurry photograph on a Thursday evening, and who he intended to be after. The money changed what was possible. It didn't change what he was. He went back to the house and slept better than he had in weeks. The meeting with Victoria happened in mid-December at the Overtown facility rather than at the Coral Gables estate, which was Logan's suggestion and which she'd agreed to without needing a reason. She arrived in a car that was expensive, but not aggressively so. She seemed to have a general policy against aggressive things, and stood in the warehouse space looking around with the attention of someone who was seeing it clearly for the first time, not through descriptions or reports, but through the actual air of it. Logan showed her the space, introduced her to Howard, who shook her hand with the slightly dazed quality of a man who'd just realized that his budget situation was about to change significantly. Introduced her to 3 of the students who were working that afternoon, including Devin, who looked at Victoria with the careful assessment of a teenager who'd learned not to assume things about wealthy people, but was willing to revise his assumptions based on evidence. Victoria asked the students real questions, not performance questions, not the kind of thing that adults ask young people to demonstrate interest, but questions that implied she was going to use the answers. What tools they used, what they wanted to learn, what was missing from the program that they actually needed. Devin, after a moment of measuring her, said, "Better diagnostic equipment. The stuff here is from like 2009. Cars talk differently now. You need to be able to hear what they're saying." Victoria looked at Logan. "He's right," Logan said. "Get me a list," Victoria said to Devin. "Specific models, current pricing. I want it in 2 weeks." Devin blinked. "You want me to research it and write it up, like a proposal?" She said it matter-of-factly. "If it's a good list, I'll fund it." The kid looked at Logan. "She means it," Logan said. After the students had gone back to work, Logan and Victoria stood near the door, out of earshot, and talked about the program's needs, the real ones, not the performance for a donor version. The equipment gap was real. The curriculum was real. There was also a staffing issue. Howard was essentially a volunteer at this point, donating his time out of commitment, and that wasn't sustainable. The program needed a paid structure if it was going to last. "I've been talking to the foundation board," Victoria said. "The endowment for this program can be increased significantly, enough to address the equipment and fund 2 full-time positions." "That covers Howard and a program coordinator," Logan said, "and your directorship is consulting, which comes from a separate allocation." She paused. "I want to expand it, eventually. Satellite programs, 2 or 3 more facilities in underserved areas in Miami-Dade. This model works, but it only reaches 12 kids right now. It reaches 12 kids well, Logan said. That matters. I know. I'm not saying rush it. I'm saying the vision is bigger. He looked at her, at the profile of a woman who was standing in a converted warehouse in Overtown, thinking about expansion like it was a solvable problem, which to her it probably was, because she had both the resources and the genuine inclination to solve it. He thought about what her grandfather had written. Find people who tell you the truth when lying would cost them nothing. He thought about whether he qualified. He thought about the blurry photograph and the $500 and the long drive home with a charred Ferrari on a trailer, and a decision he'd made before he knew the size of it. You know what bothered me most about Merritt? He said. Victoria looked at him. What? Not the fraud itself, the 20 minutes. He paused. He was here for 20 minutes and told your family their grandfather's car was garbage. He sat with your grief for 20 minutes and used it. Logan looked at the warehouse floor. I don't have a lot of patience for people who do that. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Neither do I. I know. He looked at her. That's why this works. She looked slightly startled, not by the sentiment, but by the directness of it, the way he'd said it like a simple observation rather than a compliment. Then something in her expression settled, the way things settle when they're recognized rather than performed. I have something for you, she said. She reached into the bag she'd been carrying and took out something wrapped in tissue paper. It was about the size of a paperback book, slightly heavier. She held it out to him. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a photograph in a simple frame. Black and white, old. The photo itself probably 40 years old, maybe more. It showed a man in his 50s standing in front of a car. The man was well-dressed, not showy about it, and he was looking at the car rather than the camera. The car was the GTO. Unmistakable, even in the old photograph, the lines of it immediately familiar to Logan now after all the hours he'd spent with it. The man's expression was not pride exactly. It was something more quiet than pride. That's grandfather, Victoria said. Early 80s, I think. I found it in the journal box. Logan looked at the photograph. At the man who'd kept the car as a reminder of something. At the car that had sat under a tarp for 3 years waiting to be found by someone who would look at a blurry photograph on a Thursday evening and recognize, in the shape of a burned-out front end, something worth driving an hour to see. Thank you, Logan said. I thought you should have it. It belongs in a shop. She paused. He would have liked you. Logan looked at the photograph for another moment, then at her. How can you know that? Because he liked people who paid attention, she said simply. He said that was the rarest quality in the world. Not intelligence, not ambition, just actually paying attention to what's in front of you. Logan wrapped the photograph carefully and held it. Outside, the December afternoon was doing its Florida thing. The light going amber and low, the palm trees moving in a wind that had some real air in it for once, the sky turning the colors it reserved for endings and beginnings, which were often the same color. He drove home through the early evening traffic with the photograph on the passenger seat and the legal pad still in his wallet, and Caleb's school performance review on the kitchen table at home, waiting to be signed, and the rear tires on the truck that were, he noticed now, in the particular way you notice things when you no longer have a reason to defer them, genuinely needing replacement. He made a note to handle that this week. Not because the money made him think about it differently, because he'd been putting it off, and Caleb had noticed, and the thing about actually paying attention to what's in front of you was that eventually you had to do something about what you saw. He stopped at the hardware store on the way home, picked up weather stripping for the back door of the house, which had been letting in a draft since September. $5 and change. He paid for it in cash from the money in his wallet. The ordinary money, the kind that had always been there, the kind that had always had to be enough. It was still the same wallet, still the same cash, still the same hand that counted it out. That was the thing about the money. He was starting to understand. It didn't change what your hands knew. It didn't change what you'd learned from your father about shortcuts showing up eventually. It didn't change the fact that a brake line needed to be traced, and a carburetor needed to be rebuilt, and 16-year-olds needed someone to stand beside them and ask questions instead of giving answers. What it changed was the margin, the room between the problem and the wall, the ability to do the right thing without it costing you something you couldn't afford. He'd always known what the right thing was. He'd just been doing it in a smaller space. Now the space was larger. He intended to fill it the same way he'd filled the smaller one, carefully, without shortcuts, paying attention to what was actually in front of him. He pulled into the driveway, got out, and stood for a moment looking at the house. The cracked driveway, the scraggly palm, the light on in Caleb's window upstairs where the boy was probably reading past his bedtime with a flashlight in the way he thought he was concealing, but which Logan had always known about and found too endearing to address. He went inside. The weather stripping could wait until morning. Tonight he had a performance review to sign, and a kid to pretend to catch reading, and a dog who would need his dinner with the urgency of an animal for whom every dinner was the first. The ordinary world doing what it did. He was glad to be in it. January arrived the way it always does in South Florida, without the drama that the rest of the country associates with a new year. No snow, no hard freeze, no visible evidence that anything had changed except the date on receipts and the particular quality of the light, which in January went crystalline and sharp, the kind of clear that only happens when the humidity drops far enough to let the sky be what it actually is. Logan noticed the light the morning he drove to the tire shop to get the rear tires replaced on the truck. He'd made the appointment the week before, had finally made the appointment, after months of noting the wear and deferring it for reasons that were partly financial and partly the simple human tendency to manage the urgent over the merely necessary. Caleb had been right to notice. The tires were bad. They'd been bad since September. He sat in the waiting area of the tire shop for 40 minutes reading a magazine that was 8 months old, drinking coffee from a machine that produced something approximately coffee adjacent, and thought about the fact that he was sitting in this waiting area with $10 million in his bank account waiting to get tires replaced on a truck that he could now easily replace entirely, and that this felt completely correct. Not ironic, not tragic, not even particularly interesting, just correct. The truck worked. The tires needed replacing. You replaced the tires. His phone buzzed. Rios. The plea negotiations collapsed, Rios said without preamble. Merritt's attorney made another run at a deal last week and the U.S. Attorney's Office declined again. We're going to trial. When? They've set a date, 14 months out, give or take continuances. A pause. His attorney is going to make this complicated. They're planning to argue that the authentication of the vehicle was inherently uncertain at the time of the fire assessment, that Merritt's professional judgment was within the reasonable range of expert opinion, and that the subsequent authentication is a result of advances in methodology that didn't exist 3 years ago. Logan absorbed that. Can they make that argument stick? With a good jury and a skilled attorney, arguments have stuck that had no business sticking. That's why we've been thorough. Rios's voice carried the particular flatness of a federal agent who'd spent 16 years watching the gap between what was true and what was provable. Ferdinand's expert testimony will be central, and yours. I'll be there. I know you will. A brief pause. How are you doing with everything? It was an unusual question from Rios, who generally kept their conversations transactional. Logan considered it honestly. I'm working, he said, staying in the work. That's probably the right answer. The tires were done 20 minutes later. He drove home on rubber that gripped the road the way it was supposed to and felt the difference immediately. That small fundamental correction of a thing that had been slightly wrong for long enough that you'd adjusted to it and forgotten what right felt like. The trial was 14 months away. The money was in his account. The shop was busier than it had ever been. Word had gotten around in the collector car community the way word always gets around, without anyone saying the specific thing, just the ambient understanding that Logan Hayes had done something remarkable and knew what he was doing, and the Miami dealer who'd said come back when you have more capacity had called in January with 4 vehicles he wanted restored over the course of the year, which was exactly the kind of steady work that had previously been out of reach. He hired an assistant. Her name was Gabrielle. Gabby, she said immediately. 24 years old, 2 years out of an automotive program at Miami-Dade College, with quick hands and the ability to take instruction once and not need it repeated, which was the only quality Logan had specified when he'd posted the position. She was also, it became clear in the first week, someone who asked questions with the particular fearlessness of a young person who'd decided that the cost of not knowing something was higher than the cost of admitting you didn't know it. She asked him, on her third day, about the GTO. Not aggressively. She'd heard something, through the car community, the vague outline of a story about a fire-damaged Ferrari and a mechanic from Palmetto Bay. She asked the way someone asks about something they're genuinely curious about and aren't sure they're allowed to ask. Logan thought about it for a moment. Then he told her. Not all of it. The shape of it. The listing, the examination, Ferdinand, the authentication, merit, the sale. He left out the specific numbers because the numbers weren't the point, and he left out Victoria because that wasn't his to share without her permission. What he left in was the part about paying attention, about looking at the blurry photograph and recognizing the nose of something important and deciding that was worth a 2-hour round trip on a Thursday afternoon. When he finished, Gabby was quiet for a moment. Then, "You paid $500. "Yes. And you knew what it was before you bought it." "I suspected what it might be. There's a difference." "But you told her anyway. After you bought it." "Yes." She thought about that. She was wiping down a workbench, the cloth moving in small circles while she processed, and there was something in her expression that wasn't exactly disbelief, more the recalibration of someone adjusting a mental model. "My last job," she said slowly, "the guy who owned the shop found a '69 Boss 429 at an estate sale that the family had listed as a standard Mustang. He knew immediately. He didn't say anything." "What did he do with it?" "Sold it for 4 times what he paid." She paused. "He talked about it like it was the best business decision he'd ever made." "And?" She shrugged. "And I guess it was a good business decision." She looked at Logan. "But you couldn't do that." "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly, without it sounding like he was performing virtue. "Because I looked her in the eye and said I'd tell her. And after that, it wasn't a business decision anymore. It was just what I said I'd do." Gabby nodded slowly, went back to the workbench, then, "Does it bother you, the money you didn't keep?" "Sometimes," Logan said. He was threading a bolt and didn't look up. "In the middle of the night sometimes, yeah. I think about the numbers. That's what brains do at 3 in the morning." He set the bolt. "In the daytime, it doesn't bother me." "What's different in the daytime?" "Caleb wakes up." He looked up at her. "Hard to sit and regret about a decision when the person who benefits most from you being who you are is eating cereal across the kitchen table." Gabby looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. Not at the sentiment, but at the delivery, the flatness of it, the absolute absence of self-congratulation. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, that makes sense." She was good. He was glad he'd hired her. The months moved. The Overtown program expanded its enrollment from 12 to 22 students by the spring, after a grant from the Ashford Foundation came through, and they were able to hire a second instructor and extend the program hours. Devon's diagnostic equipment proposal, the one Victoria had asked him to write up, had been thorough enough that she'd funded it in full, which had produced in Devon a particular kind of confidence that Logan recognized as the confidence of a person who'd been taken seriously by someone they respected. It was different from ordinary self-esteem. It was the confidence of someone who'd learned that they were capable of doing something real in the world. Devon started talking about certification programs, about what it would take to become a master technician. Logan connected him with 2 people in the industry who could give him accurate information about those paths, which was different from telling him what those paths were. A distinction Logan had learned from his own father, and which he tried to pass forward consistently. Victoria came to the program once a month. She was not performatively involved. She didn't arrive with a camera crew or a publicist, or the particular energy of wealthy people who want their philanthropy to be visible. She came, looked at what was happening, talked to the students and Howard and Gabby when Gabby was there for a crossover day, and left with a list of follow-up items that she actually followed up on. The students had, within 2 months, developed the wary respect that teenagers give to adults who do what they say and don't need to be thanked for it. Logan and Victoria had developed a working relationship that neither of them had bothered to define, because defining it would have required a category and no existing category quite fit. They were not friends in the ordinary sense. They hadn't shared enough ordinary life for that, didn't have the texture of friendship, the stupid jokes and comfortable silences of people who'd been through small things together. What they'd been through was large, and that created a different kind of connection, something that required less maintenance and carried more weight. They talked on the phone twice a week, usually about the program, sometimes about the federal case, occasionally about nothing in particular, a documentary one of them had watched, a car that had come through the shop, a thing that Caleb had said that was either brilliant or strange or both. She asked about Caleb often, always specifically, not "how's Caleb" as a social lubricant, but actual questions. How was the mangrove project received? Did he stay with his school friend Marcus over spring break? What was he reading? Logan appreciated it in a way he didn't examine closely, because examining it closely would have required a vocabulary he didn't currently have. The trial date approached the way trial dates do. Distantly, then suddenly. 14 months became 12, then 8, then 4. Rios called with updates that were detailed and reassuring in the way of someone who was managing a witness's anxiety without acknowledging that was what he was doing. Ferdinand was deposed twice and described both depositions as exercises in patience. The civil suits from the other affected families had produced settlements in 2 cases, undisclosed amounts, though Rios had told Logan privately that both settlements were significant, and the remaining 2 were still pending. Merritt's legal team had attempted 3 additional motions to suppress Logan's documentation, all of which were denied. They had attempted to establish that the authentication process itself had introduced bias into the valuation analysis, an argument that Ferdinand had addressed in a 20-page supplementary report that was described by the government's forensic accountant as the most thorough takedown of a defense argument I have seen in 19 years of federal cases. Ferdinand had reported this compliment with the satisfaction of a man who had spent decades in a field where precision was the only currency. What Logan was not prepared for, 14 months after Dale Merritt had been arrested in Fort Lauderdale on a Thursday morning in November, was the moment he actually walked into the federal courthouse in Miami. He'd been in courthouses before, traffic matters, a minor business dispute years ago over a vendor contract, the architecture of them, the institutional weight, the particular smell of climate-controlled air in a building full of consequence. He knew what courtrooms looked like. He was not prepared for how it felt to sit in one while a federal prosecutor laid out what Dale Merritt had done, in a voice that was careful and precise and made no editorializing because the facts, organized correctly, did all the work. 8 families, 22 years of professional practice used as cover for 12 years of systematic fraud, $41 million in total undervalued assets across 8 claims. Real people who had trusted a professional assessment during moments of loss, estate settlements, fire damage, flood damage, and had been told their things were worth almost nothing, while the man doing the telling had already arranged for those things to disappear into his own network and resurface elsewhere at their actual value. Logan sat in the gallery and listened. Victoria sat beside him. She had come, had told him she needed to be there, and he hadn't argued because she was right. They didn't speak much during the proceedings. There wasn't much to say that the room wasn't already saying. The trial ran for 11 days. Testimony from Ferdinand took most of a day, delivered with the unhurried clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that expertise is only useful when you can explain it to people who don't share it. The financial forensics expert took 2 days. Logan's testimony, when it came, took 4 hours spread across an afternoon and the following morning. He was not a natural courtroom presence. He was not eloquent in the way that made jurors lean forward. What he was, when he sat in the witness stand and answered the prosecutor's questions and then the defense attorney's questions, was precise and consistent and entirely unaffected by the pressure to be otherwise. He described what he'd seen in the photograph. He described what he had found in the garage. He described every step of the documentation process, every number he'd cross-referenced, every call he'd made and when and why. He described the coffee shop meeting with Merritt in the same flat tone he'd used for everything else, not performing outrage, just reporting what had been said and what it had meant. The defense attorney tried twice to suggest that Logan's decision to purchase the car before fully disclosing its potential value constituted a form of exploitation. Logan looked at him evenly. "I disclosed everything I knew within 48 hours of completing enough research to know something," Logan said. "I told the seller what I suspected before I bought it, and I told her the full picture as soon as the authentication was underway. I also transferred $4 million to her family voluntarily, with no legal obligation to do so. He paused. If that's exploitation, I'm not sure what the alternative looks like. There was a sound in the gallery, not quite laughter, more a collective exhalation, the sound of a room registering that an answer has landed correctly. The defense attorney moved on. Caleb had asked, the morning before Logan's testimony, whether he could come. Logan had thought about it. It's going to be boring for most of it, he said. I have to answer a lot of questions that don't sound dramatic. But it's real, Caleb said. Yes. Then I want to see real. He sat in the gallery with Victoria, who had quietly and without making it a thing taken the seat next to him and kept him company through 4 hours of testimony that was, as Logan had predicted, mostly not dramatic. But Caleb watched it with the attention he gave to things that mattered, still, focused, taking it in. Logan could see him from the witness stand, small in the gallery, serious. He focused on the questions and answered them and tried not to let the sight of his son watching him change how he said things, though in some way he couldn't prevent it. Knowing Caleb was there made him more careful and more honest, not less, which was maybe the point of having someone in the room who saw you clearly. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Logan was at the shop when the call came from Rios. He was replacing a head gasket on the Triumph TR6 that had been waiting since January, which required the particular patience of a man who had learned that rushing a head gasket job produced consequences that were significantly more expensive than the time you'd saved. Guilty, Rios said. All counts. Logan set down the torque wrench. All eight fraud counts. Both conspiracy charges. The money laundering. Rios paused. Sentencing is in 60 days. What's he looking at? Federal guidelines put it at 17 to 22 years. His attorney will argue for the low end. The prosecution will push for the high end given the scope and duration. Another pause. The restitution order will be comprehensive. His assets, his estate, everything that can be accessed will go toward repaying the victims. Logan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the engine in front of him, at the exposed head, the precision of the components, the way the thing was built to work perfectly, and failed only when the people maintaining it cut corners or missed something or simply didn't pay close enough attention. Rios, he said. Thank you. You did the work, Rios said. It was the same thing he'd said before months ago, but it landed differently now. Not as procedural acknowledgement, but as something meant. I want you to know that. 3 of the 8 families we wouldn't have found without the initial documentation you built. They would never have known. You found them. After he hung up, he called Victoria. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd already heard. Rios's office had notified the victim families simultaneously. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who'd been preparing to receive either outcome and had organized themselves accordingly. All counts, she said. All counts, Logan confirmed. A silence that was not uncomfortable. The particular quiet of 2 people who've been through something long and difficult, arriving at the same point at the same time and not needing to perform relief for each other. I want to go to his house, Victoria said finally. What? Grandfather's house. After sentencing. I want to go sit in the study. I've been avoiding it somehow. I keep going there for work reasons, estate reasons, program reasons. I haven't just sat there since he died. Okay, Logan said. Will you come? He thought about why she would ask him rather than someone who'd known Edward Ashford, someone with history in that room. He thought about the photograph on his shop wall. The old man looking at his car in the early 80s, not at the camera, the private expression of someone in a moment that was his alone. He thought about what Victoria had said. Find people who tell you the truth when lying would cost them nothing. Keep them close. Yeah, he said. I'll come. The sentencing happened 63 days after the verdict. Logan drove to the federal courthouse alone this time. Caleb was at school. Victoria had her own car. There was no ceremony required. He sat in the gallery in a row 3 behind the victim families. 8 families represented in varying configurations, some with attorneys, some without. The specific geometry of people who'd come to see an ending. The judge sentenced Dale Merritt to 19 years. 19 years in federal prison. Full restitution to all 8 victim families, to be paid from liquidated assets in an order determined by the court. Merritt stood to receive the sentence wearing a suit that no longer fit him well, and with the expression of a man who had spent 20 months constructing alternative realities for himself and was finally being required to inhabit the actual one. Logan watched him. He'd thought he might feel something violent, the satisfaction of watching someone punished, the appetite for it that's human and not particularly admirable. What he felt instead was quieter. Completion, maybe. The closing of an equation that had been open too long. He didn't stay for the press statement that the U.S. Attorney's Office made in the lobby. He walked out through the side exit, stood in the Miami January air, crystalline, sharp, the same quality it had been all month, and called Caleb's school to make sure pickup was still covered for today. Mrs. Fernandez had it. Good. He drove to Coral Gables. Victoria met him at the gate, which was unusual. She generally was already inside when he arrived, and meeting at the gate had the slight quality of a person who'd been watching for him. She was wearing a coat that she didn't strictly need in 63-degree Florida winter, but had put on anyway, which was something Logan associated with people whose bodies process stress as cold. They walked through the main house and down the hall to the study without talking much. She unlocked the study door with a key she'd had on her keychain the whole time he'd known her, and the smell hit them both. Old paper, cedar, the faint ghost of a man who'd lived in this room for decades. She sat in Edward Ashford's chair behind the desk. Logan sat in the chair across from it, the one he'd occupied during the weeks of document work, which had shaped itself into a comfortable familiarity. The room was the same as it always was. Books on the shelves in their slightly idiosyncratic order. The framed photographs that Logan had looked at enough times now to know by position without examining them closely. The window with the particular afternoon light. Victoria put her hands flat on the desk and looked at them. He would have hated it, she said. The trial, the publicity, he was a private man. But the outcome, she thought about it honestly. The outcome he would have been satisfied with. Not pleased. He didn't get pleased easily. Satisfied. She looked up. He would have been satisfied that it was done correctly. It was done correctly, Logan said, because you started it correctly. She looked at him. That matters. How you start something determines more about how it ends than anything else. Logan thought about a Thursday evening at a kitchen table, a blurry photograph, a number said $500, and a shape in the blurred darkness that his hands recognized before his brain caught up. The decision to get in the truck. I just looked at the picture, Ijul, he said. You looked at the picture when other people would have scrolled past it. She said it directly without embellishment. That's not nothing, Logan. That's everything. They sat in the study for a while after that. Not long, says maybe 30 minutes. It was not a melancholy silence, more the comfortable quiet of two people in a room that had contained important things and was now containing something new, which was the knowledge of what had happened and what it had cost and what it had been worth. Victoria reached into the desk drawer and took out the journal. Edward Ashford's journal, the one she'd mentioned months ago, at the beginning of all this. She'd shown him parts of it before, the specific entries about the car. Now she set it in the middle of the desk. I want you to read the last entry, she said. He wrote it 3 weeks before he died. Logan took the journal carefully. It was a leather-bound thing, old and soft with handling, the spine creased from years of being opened and closed. He turned to the last written page. The handwriting was shakier than in the earlier entries, the handwriting of illness, of a body failing faster than the mind. But the sentences were clear and deliberate, the way they always were. I have been thinking about the car, not what it's worth. I haven't thought about that in years, and I don't intend to start now. I've been thinking about why I kept it. I think I kept it because it was honest. I bought it honestly, I've maintained it honestly, and I've looked at it honestly. In a life full of complicated decisions, that car is one of the uncomplicated ones. It represents the version of myself I want to be remembered for. Whatever happens to it after I'm gone, I hope the person who finds it is the kind of person who can see it for what it is. Not just the object, the whole thing, the truth underneath. Logan read it twice. Then he closed the journal gently and set it back on the desk. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He thought about the truth underneath. about a man he'd never met who had kept a car for 30 years as a reminder to himself of who he wanted to be, about the fraud that had tried to reduce that car to nothing, about a blurry photograph and a 2-hour drive and a decision to tell the truth when the alternative was legal and profitable and nobody would ever have known, about Caleb eating cereal at the kitchen table, about Devin writing a diagnostic equipment proposal and learning that he was the kind of person whose proposals got funded, about Gabby in the shop asking real questions, about Howard at the Overtown facility finally having a budget that matched his effort, about 8 families in a courthouse who would receive restitution checks that could not fully repair what had been taken but were real and substantial and hard-won, about his father's voice. The shortcuts always show up eventually. About his own voice to Caleb months ago. We're going to be better than okay. They were. He drove back to Palmetto Bay in the late afternoon, the January light doing its crystalline thing the whole way down. He stopped at the grocery store because there was nothing at home for dinner, navigated the cereal aisle without doing the math, and put the box with the cartoon toucan in the cart. Because, why not? Because Caleb had wanted it for 2 years, and the reason for saying not today had been replaced by a better reason to say yes. Caleb was at Mrs. Fernandez's when Logan got home. He could see them through her kitchen window, the boy and the old woman sitting at her table with what looked like dominoes between them, the dog visible as a gray shape near the back door. He texted that dinner would be ready at 6:30 and got back a thumbs-up emoji followed immediately by a question mark, which was Caleb's shorthand for "what is it?" which meant he was interested. Logan texted back, "Pasta," and the toucan cereal for dessert. A pause. Then, "That's not how dessert works. New rules." Another pause. Then a smiley face, which for a 7-year-old who considered himself too sophisticated for smiley faces was tantamount to a declaration of happiness. Logan put the groceries away and started the water for pasta and stood in his kitchen in the January light and thought about the photograph on his shop wall. Edward Ashford looking at his car in the early 80s with that private expression, not at the camera, not performing anything, just present with a thing that meant something to him. Logan understood it now in a way he hadn't when Victoria first handed him the frame. It wasn't about the car. The car was a container for something else, a principle, an intention, a version of the self that a man wanted to keep visible to himself. The car said, "This is what honest looks like. Don't forget." Logan didn't need a car for that. He had the shop and the hand-painted sign and the shop stool where he'd sat the night everything changed, and the memory of an empty space in the back bay where something had waited 3 years to be found by someone willing to look. He had Caleb, who at 7 years old had already figured out that his father was the kind of person who didn't cut corners, and had quietly organized his own sense of right and wrong around that understanding in ways that would take years to fully see. He had, he realized, exactly what he'd always had, just more room around it now, more space to do it properly, more margin between the problem and the wall. The water came to a boil. He added salt, more than he used to, because Phil the accountant had once told him that the one thing wealthy people do consistently different from everyone else is use enough salt in pasta water, which was either profound or absurd, and Logan had decided it was both and acted accordingly. When Caleb came through the door at 6:25, 5 minutes early, which was the child equivalent of running, he dropped his backpack in the hall and his shoes near but not in the shoe spot and came directly to the kitchen where he climbed onto the counter stool and looked at Logan with the frank assessment he brought to most things. "You're okay," Caleb said. Not a question. "Yeah, bud, I'm okay." "The trial thing is done?" "The trial thing is done." Caleb nodded, processing. "And the bad guy?" "In prison for a long time. The people he hurt are going to get their money back." The boy absorbed this with his characteristic gravity, the look of someone confirming that the world is structured the way it's supposed to be, that the framework holds. "Good," he said. Just that. Good. The single word of a kid who'd been watching his father work for a year to arrive at this answer and found the answer correct. They ate pasta at the kitchen table, the windows dark with the early winter night, Rust under the table doing his eternal optimistic waiting. Caleb ate 2 bowls, which was unusual, and talked about something that had happened with Marcus at school involving a soccer ball and a factual dispute that had escalated in ways that neither of them felt entirely good about. And he wanted to know what Logan thought he should do. Logan listened. He asked questions. He did not provide the answer because the answer was already somewhere in Caleb's account of it. The child just needed to find it, which he did, about 8 minutes in, arriving at it with the visible satisfaction of independent discovery. "I should apologize first," Caleb said, even though he was also wrong, because me apologizing first doesn't make what he did okay, it just makes things better faster. "Yeah," Logan said. "That's right." Caleb thought about this for another moment. "That's what you did with the car lady, right? You didn't have to give her the money, but you did because it made things right faster." Logan looked at his son. 8 years old in March, old enough to be drawing the lines between things, connecting the patterns, building the framework of how the world worked from the specific examples his father put in front of him. "More or less," Logan said. "Is she nice? The car lady." "Victoria." Logan said her name because Caleb had spent a year hearing about her in general terms and deserved a name. "Yeah, she's good people." "Is she your friend?" Logan considered the question with appropriate seriousness because Caleb's questions deserved that. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Something like that." Caleb nodded, satisfied, and moved on to requesting the toucan cereal, which Logan produced, and which the kid ate standing at the counter because apparently some experiences are better consumed vertically, a position which Logan chose not to argue with. Later, with Caleb in bed and the house quiet, Logan went to the shop. He did this sometimes, like came to the shop at night not to work, but just to be in the space. He'd done it before the Ferrari, when the night felt too full to sleep in the house. He still did it now, for different reasons. He turned on the corner radio, the classic rock station that still faded in humidity, but tonight was coming in clear, and sat on the stool in the center of the shop. The TR6 was in the main bay, engine exposed, the kind of work that required patience and wouldn't be rushed. The Mustang Fastback was in the back bay, where the GTO had been, getting started properly now. The shop smelled like metal and oil and the specific chemical note of new upholstery he'd been working on for a customer's Buick Riviera. On the wall above the workbench in the simple frame Victoria had given him, Edward Ashford looked at his car. Logan looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he looked around the shop, at the tools in their places, at the half-finished vehicles, at the hand-painted sign visible through the front window where the parking lot light caught it. Hayes Restoration. He'd need a better sign eventually. Not because he wanted to be flashier, he didn't particularly, but because the current one was fading and the letters weren't level, and it was the first thing people saw, and he'd always believed that the way you presented the entrance to your work said something about how you thought about the work. His father had had a proper sign. Logan had been meaning to for 4 years. He added it to the list in his wallet, which had grown and been replaced twice with fresh legal pad pages, but which he still carried the same way, folded twice, back left pocket. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The shop needed things. The Overtown program needed things. Devin would need someone to connect him to certification programs in 6 months, and there were 3 other students in the program who were at similar junctures, needing similar navigation. The federal case, even with sentencing done, would have trailing edges, civil restitution proceedings, depositions for related cases that Rios had mentioned were beginning to emerge from the investigation's wider net. There was Caleb, who needed homework help, and someone to care about the Marcus situation, and a father who paid attention. There was Gabby, who was good in learning and would need real mentorship if she was going to become what she was capable of becoming. There was Rust, who needed his leg managed and his dinners on time, and to be allowed to believe that today might finally be the day the table scraps arrived. There was Victoria, who needed, he wasn't entirely sure what Victoria needed. Someone who didn't treat her the way people treated billionaires, who saw the person inside the circumstance. He thought he might be figuring out how to be that, imperfectly, without a category for it. The radio played something he half recognized from the 70s, a guitar intro that belonged to some specific summer in someone's memory, though not his. He didn't know all the songs. He listened to the radio for the ones he knew and tolerated the ones he didn't, which was a reasonable approach to most things. He sat in his shop in the Florida January night and thought, this is where I am. Not where he'd imagined being at 32, not the specific version, but the essential shape of it, a space full of work that mattered. A kid down the road who was going to be okay, the knowledge that when he'd had a chance to do the right thing in the moment that counted, he'd done it. That was something. That was, if he was honest about it, most of what he'd ever wanted. The money was real, and the money mattered, and he wasn't going to pretend it didn't. But the money was the shape of things, not the substance. The substance was what had always been true, that the work was worth doing, and the truth was worth telling, and the shortcuts, every single one, showed up eventually. His father had told him that. His father, who had run a body shop in Sarasota for 30 years and died without much money, and without any fame, and without a Ferrari hidden in anyone's garage, but who had built something in Logan that was more durable than any of those things. A way of looking at what's in front of you, a habit of paying attention, a refusal to pretend you don't see what you see. Logan had driven an hour on a Thursday afternoon because of a blurry photograph in a shape he recognized. He'd paid $500 for a car worth $14 million and told the truth about it before the ink on the receipt was dry. He'd built a file for 3 weeks, precise and documented and careful, because precision mattered and documentation mattered and careful mattered, and then he'd handed it to people with the authority to act on it and let the system do what it was supposed to do. And the system had done it, slowly, imperfectly, with 14 months of legal machinery and 3 days of jury deliberation and 60 more days of waiting. But it had done it. 19 years, 8 families made whole, or as whole as money could make them. One man's scheme, 12 years in the building, undone by a mechanic who'd been paying attention on a Thursday evening when attention was inconvenient and expensive and the easier path was right there. Logan Hayes sat in his shop and listened to the radio and felt, not for the first time but more completely than before, the specific satisfaction of having done something correctly. Not heroically. Heroism required a different story than the one he'd lived, required more drama and less paperwork. Just correctly. The way you thread a bolt to the right torque. The way you trace a brake line from symptom to source and fix the actual problem rather than the symptom. The way you look at a blurry photograph until you see what's actually there. He sat there until the song ended. Then he turned off the radio, turned off the lights, and walked back to the house under the January sky, which was clear and sharp and full of stars that had been there all along, waiting for the humidity to drop far enough to let them be visible. Some things were like that, already there, just waiting for the right conditions and someone willing to look.